The world 40,000 years ago was both familiar and alien. Continents were not yet arranged as we know them. The Earth's pulse was cold, locked in the grip of an ice age that drew oceans into vast frozen sheets, exposing lands that are now drowned beneath the waves. In Africa, the birthplace of humanity, small bands of Homo sapiens had already begun to wander far beyond their ancestral savannas. They were driven not by conquest, but by something deeper, an ancient curiosity to see what lay beyond the horizon. In this frozen age, the planet was a patchwork of extremes. To the north, Europe lay beneath glaciers stretching for thousands of kilometers. To the south and east, the vast plains of Asia shimmered with dust and heat. Yet across this unstable world, one species, ours, was beginning to thrive where others faltered. Homo neanderthalensis clung to their final refuges in the cold valleys of Europe. The mysterious Denisovans left faint traces across the highlands of Asia. On the island of Flores, tiny humans no taller than a child, Homo floresiensis, still hunted pygmy elephants in the jungle. The planet was home to multiple human worlds, each adapting in its own way. But one of them would go farther than any had gone before. The story of how Homo sapiens reached Australia, the continent of red deserts, giant beasts, and timeless songlines, is among the greatest mysteries in all of prehistory. For tens of thousands of years, Australia was isolated by ocean. Even during the Ice Age, when sea levels dropped over 100 meters, the continent was still separated by deep channels of open water. No animal, no earlier human had ever crossed. Yet somehow, our ancestors did. Imagine the moment. A small group of people stands at the edge of an unfamiliar shore somewhere in ancient Indonesia. Before them lies an ocean shimmering beneath a sun of molten gold. There is no visible land on the horizon, only wind and waves. Behind them, volcanic mountains breathe smoke into the sky. They carry children, stone tools, and bundles of plant fiber. And they face a decision that will change the destiny of their species. To stay where it is safe, or to trust the unknown. They were not sailors in the modern sense. They had no compasses, no maps, no written language. Their vessels were not ships, but rafts, bundles of bamboo, logs, and vines lashed together with sinew and hope. Yet, in the deep silence of prehistory, these people accomplished something no other creature on Earth had done. They crossed the sea by design. Why did they do it? Survival may have been one reason. Population pressures, droughts, or dwindling food could have forced them to move. But perhaps something else, curiosity, imagination, pushed them forward. For the first time, humanity began to see the ocean not as a barrier, but as a pathway. Across what is now the islands of Wallacea, stretching from Borneo and Sulawesi to Timor, humans advanced step by step, island by island. Each crossing took courage, planning, and luck. These were not random wanderers swept away by currents. They were pioneers. At the time, the world's geography was different. Southeast Asia was joined into a vast subcontinent called Sunda. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were fused into another landmass known as Sahul. Between them lay a chain of islands separated by deep straits. To reach Sahul, one had to cross at least 70 to 100 kilometers of open sea, an extraordinary feat for a species that had only just mastered the use of fire and stone. For archaeologists, this raises one of the most profound questions of human history. Did they understand what they were doing? Was this an accidental drift, or a deliberate voyage? Recent studies suggest intention. Evidence from northern Australia shows humans arrived in groups large enough to sustain populations, dozens, perhaps hundreds. That would require organized planning, knowledge of navigation, and cooperation. In a sense, this was the dawn of humanity's maritime mind, the birth of the explorer's instinct that would, millennia later, carry us across every ocean on the planet. But before reaching that far horizon, the world around them was still untamed. The megafauna of the Pleistocene reigned supreme. Giant marsupials roamed the forests of Sahul, kangaroos taller than men, wombats the size of cars, and predators like Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion with shearing teeth like blades. In the skies, enormous birds, Geniornis, the demon duck of doom, stalked the wetlands. These were creatures that had never seen humans before. To them, the newcomers would have seemed like fragile, hairless intruders. Yet within a few thousand years, it would be these newcomers who reshaped the land forever. Archaeological traces whisper the story. At sites like Majid Bebe in northern Australia, stone tools and pigments tell of human presence dating back at least 65,000 years, far earlier than once believed. Charcoal layers suggest the use of fire. Tiny beads and ochre hint at art and ritual. The people who came here were not mere survivors. They were thinkers, artists, storytellers. To understand their journey, one must first understand their world. The Ice Age made humans both vulnerable and resilient. As glaciers expanded, the global climate cooled, deserts spread, and food became scarce. But scarcity forged innovation. We learned to store, to plan, to cooperate. Language, born perhaps in the flickering firelight of those harsh nights, became our most powerful tool. It allowed a group to share ideas, dreams, and plans, to coordinate the construction of rafts, to teach navigation by stars, to imagine lands unseen. That imagination, unseen yet believed, was the seed of exploration. When modern humans began leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago, few could have predicted how far they would go. They followed rivers, coasts, and valleys. They crossed deserts and mountains. Some turned north toward Europe, others east into Asia. But a few, just a few, looked farther still. Their route wound through India, down into Southeast Asia, and eventually toward the farthest edge of the known world. There, they met a horizon that seemed to end all horizons: the sea. And yet, that sea would not stop them. In this first chapter, the ocean is not yet crossed, but the stage is set. The world is alive with potential and peril. Every species struggles for survival, but one, our own, begins to think beyond survival. The first sparks of creativity, courage, and unity ignite within small bands scattered along the coasts of Asia. Perhaps one night, standing beneath a sky brilliant with stars, an ancient human looked across the water and wondered what lay beyond. They did not have the words for continent, Australia, or Sahul. But they had curiosity, and that was enough. The waves lapped against the shore, whispering secrets of the unknown. And slowly, humanity began to listen. Across the shimmering blue expanse lay a world no human eye had ever seen. A land of strange giants and endless silence. A continent untouched by human footprints for millions of years. This was Sahul, the prehistoric supercontinent that would one day fracture into Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. In the days when the world's oceans were locked in ice, sea levels dropped so low that vast stretches of land emerged, binding islands together into new continents. Yet even then, Sahul remained cut off by deep ocean trenches. a final barrier that only imagination and courage could cross. To those who stood on the last island of Asia, the air would have smelled of salt and mystery. The sea before them was alive, restless, whispering with promise and danger. Beyond it, the unknown land waited, rich with life but empty of humankind. It was a place of giant reptiles, thundering marsupials, and forests that shimmered in the ancient light. The people could not know what awaited them there, but the instinct to move forward, to explore, had already become part of what it meant to be human. The first people to reach Sahul did not arrive by accident. They brought with them stories, tools, and fire. The journey would not have been a single daring leap, but a series of steps, generations moving across the chain of islands that dotted the ocean between Sunda and Sahul. Each island became both home and stepping stone. Some groups settled, others continued eastward, driven by something they could not name, perhaps hunger, perhaps hope. And at last, one group saw the sea open before them and decided to go farther than any human had gone before. Archaeologists have traced these steps through the evidence they left behind: flakes of stone, pigments of ochre, remnants of fire. On the island of Timor, there are signs of humans catching deep-sea fish over 40,000 years ago, proof that they understood the sea far better than we once imagined. They may have watched the flight of birds, the drift of clouds, or the direction of floating logs to sense the presence of unseen land. They may have built rafts sturdy enough for families and fires. In their minds, the ocean was no longer chaos, it was a living path. When they reached Sahul, the world would have changed. Imagine their first steps on a strange shore, the sand hot beneath their feet, the sun higher and harsher than in the islands they had left behind. The trees looked different. The cries of unseen animals echoed through the forest. In the distance, the ground trembled, not with thunder but with the footsteps of creatures beyond imagination. A diprotodon, a wombat the size of a car, lumbered through the brush. Towering kangaroos bounded across the plains. Giant lizards, ancestors of the Komodo dragon, hunted in the shadows. For the newcomers, this was paradise and peril intertwined. There was water, food, and space to roam, but also predators and extremes. The climate swung between wet and dry, heat and frost. Yet these humans adapted quickly. They learned to read the land, to hunt by tracking prints, to gather roots and seeds unknown to their ancestors. Their fires reshaped the landscape, creating clearings where grass grew and animals gathered. Within a few generations, they were no longer strangers. They were the first Australians. Evidence from sites like Lake Mungo and Majid Bebe tells us that by at least 65,000 years ago, humans were living, building, and dreaming in Sahul. At Lake Mungo, the bones of Mungo Man and Mungo Lady, carefully buried and sprinkled with ochre, speak of ritual, of meaning, of belief. These were not mere wanderers surviving by instinct. They were people with a sense of identity and connection. They had crossed an ocean, and in doing so they had crossed a threshold of the human spirit. Australia was unlike anywhere else on Earth. Cut off by rising seas, its ecosystems evolved in isolation. Now, humans became part of that story. Their arrival was both creative and destructive. They brought fire, which they used deliberately, burning the undergrowth to shape hunting grounds, to summon new life from ashes. This practice, known today as fire stick farming, transformed the continent. Forests became open grasslands, and new species flourished. Humans were not just adapting to nature, they were beginning to design it. But the balance was fragile. Many of the great beasts, the Megafauna, began to vanish. Some scientists argue that climate change was to blame. Others suggest that human hunting and habitat burning accelerated the extinctions. Perhaps it was both, a convergence of forces in which humanity played its first significant role in shaping the fate of entire species. As generations passed, the newcomers spread across the land. Some followed the coasts, living on fish and shellfish. Others ventured inland, learning to survive in the deserts and mountains. They developed a deep knowledge of the land's rhythms, when the rains came, where the water holes lay, which plants healed or poisoned. Their knowledge was encoded not in writing, but in stories, myths that described the birth of rivers, mountains, and stars. These stories would evolve into what modern Aboriginal Australians call the Dreamtime, a vast network of creation tales, moral codes, and maps of the land. But even at the beginning, the seeds of Dreamtime were being planted. Around the campfires of Sahul, elders told of the ancestors who crossed the waters, guided by spirits of wind and wave. The ocean crossing became more than a journey of survival. It became sacred, a memory of courage transformed into legend. To scientists today, the arrival of humans in Australia is one of the earliest and most astonishing examples of long-distance sea travel. It required planning, communication, and trust, qualities that define our species. Some researchers estimate that a successful migration would have needed at least 100 individuals, organized into multiple voyages over years or even centuries. This implies leadership, cooperation, and shared knowledge, the foundations of civilization itself. Each discovery adds a new brushstroke to this ancient picture. At archaeological digs, scientists sift through layers of sand, finding fragments of stone tools shaped by hands long vanished. They analyze pigments to understand how the first artists mixed color from earth and ash. They use genetic evidence to trace the descendants of those voyagers, the Aboriginal peoples whose DNA still carries the echoes of the first crossing. Yet for all the science, there remains a mystery that numbers and data cannot capture. What did those first humans feel as they watched the sea rise behind them, cutting them off forever from the lands of their ancestors? Did they understand that they had reached the end of the known world, a place where the sky met the earth in a shimmering mirage? Or did they simply live, day by day, unaware that they had become pioneers of history? Whatever their thoughts, their actions changed the course of human destiny. They proved that imagination could conquer geography, that courage could bridge the impossible. In crossing to Sahul, they achieved the first great oceanic migration in human history, long before the Polynesians sailed the Pacific, long before Columbus or Magellan charted their courses. They were the first true explorers. As the chapter closes, the winds over ancient Sahul carry the scent of smoke and rain. The first Australians stand upon red earth beneath a vast sky, unaware that they have begun a story that will last 40,000 years. Their footprints fade into dust, but their legacy endures, not just in bones and tools, but in the songs, stories, and spirits that still echo through the deserts and forests of Australia today. The world has changed. Humanity has crossed its first ocean, and on this new continent, a new chapter of our species begins. Every human journey begins with a single question: what lies beyond? For our ancestors, that question was not a matter of philosophy. It was survival itself. 70,000 years ago, in the dry heart of Africa, the world grew harsher. Droughts deepened, rivers shrank, and grasslands turned to dust. Herds of antelope disappeared into the distance, and with them went the lifeblood of the early Homo sapiens who had thrived for millennia along the coasts and savannas. Faced with hunger, thirst, and competition, small groups began to wander farther in search of life. What began as necessity became destiny. But necessity alone cannot explain what followed. Something else stirred inside these humans, something unique. They dreamed. They imagined lands they had never seen, skies filled with unfamiliar stars. They followed rivers to their ends and valleys to their sources. This impulse to move, to explore, to risk everything for what might be, was the spark of wanderlust that would carry our species farther than any before. The first footsteps out of Africa marked a revolution not of weapons or tools, but of mind. These were not migrations of panic or chaos. They were calculated, organized, and deeply human. The people who left Africa carried memory, language, and community. They built rafts of reeds to cross deltas, fashioned stone points sharp enough to fell gazelles, and learned to read the land for signs of rain and prey. Slowly, over generations, they spread northward through the Sinai Peninsula, into the Levant, what is now Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. There, at caves like Kafse and School, archaeologists have found their traces, delicate skeletons buried with red ochre and beads made from seashells. The ochre was not for utility. It was symbolic. It meant ritual. It meant meaning. These early migrants were no longer animals reacting to hunger. They were humans guided by thought, by belief, by something sacred. In those painted burials lies the first proof that the human journey was not just physical, but spiritual. As they pushed onward, they encountered new worlds. Grasslands gave way to forests, forests to deserts, deserts to mountains. Each landscape tested their adaptability. They learned to hunt reindeer in the cold, to fish along coasts, to weave baskets and nets. They discovered how to preserve fire through storms, to store roots and meat for lean times. Evolution was no longer just about survival of the fittest. It was about the survival of the most adaptable. And adaptability was now a human art. Their minds expanded with each horizon. They began to see patterns in the stars, in animal migrations, in the rhythm of the seasons. From those patterns came prediction, and from prediction, control. Fire could be used not only for warmth but to shape the landscape. Stone could be carved not just for tools but for beauty. Every discovery became a stepping stone toward the next. And as knowledge spread from tribe to tribe, carried on voices and memories, humanity became a network, a living mind stretching across continents. The expansion was slow but relentless. From Africa to Arabia, then across the coasts of India, they followed the southern route, hugging shorelines rich with shellfish and fresh water. Some stayed, building new homes in tropical valleys. Others moved on. By 60,000 years ago, small bands had reached the edge of Southeast Asia. The air was thick with monsoon rains, the forests alive with strange sounds. They were thousands of kilometers from the place where their journey had begun, and yet the same blood and dreams flowed through their veins. At every step they met challenges that demanded invention. The ocean forced them to build rafts. The jungle forced them to learn new plants and poisons. Predators taught them stealth. Famine taught them cooperation. And within these challenges, human intelligence evolved. The brain that once guided a hunter across the African plains now planned multi-day voyages and memorized complex coastlines. Each generation built upon the wisdom of the last, until exploration itself became part of what it meant to be human. The question that haunts scientists today is, why them? Why did Homo sapiens succeed in leaving Africa when earlier humans, Homo erectus for example, had already ventured out hundreds of thousands of years before? The answer lies not in muscle, but in mind. Homo sapiens could communicate abstract ideas. They could say, "Let's build tomorrow. Let's go where no one has gone." They could cooperate at a scale no other species could. Language transformed survival into strategy, and strategy into civilization. But this growing network of humanity did not move through an empty world. Other humans were already there. As they entered Eurasia, they encountered the Neanderthals, stocky, powerful people who had thrived in the cold north for hundreds of millennia. They met the Denisovans, mysterious cousins whose bones would one day be found in the frozen caves of Siberia, and perhaps even others now lost to time. These meetings were not always peaceful, yet in those moments of contact, whether through conflict or compassion, something extraordinary happened. They shared their genes. Modern DNA reveals that almost every person outside Africa carries traces of these encounters. 2% of Neanderthal DNA lives in Europeans and Asians. In the highlands of New Guinea and Australia, up to 6% of DNA descends from Denisovans. These were not mere passing encounters. They were unions that blended worlds. Our species did not simply replace the others. We absorbed them, carried their strength and resilience forward. The blood of extinct humans still flows within us, whispering their survival stories through our cells. To the migrants themselves, these meetings must have been bewildering. Imagine seeing another kind of human for the first time. Familiar yet foreign. They hunted, laughed, and sang as we did, but their faces were different, their voices deeper, their eyes set in skulls shaped by other ages. Did we see them as kin or as threat? Did we share fire and stories, or did we drive them away? The truth is lost, but the outcome endures. Through those encounters, we became more than we had been. As the Ice Age deepened, the paths through Asia became treacherous. Mountains froze, rivers flooded, deserts shifted. Still, humanity pressed on. The coastline became their guide, the world's first natural highway. They followed the coral reefs, the tide patterns, the flight of seabirds. With each generation, their memory of distance grew longer. They learned which stars rose above certain islands, which winds carried them home. These were the foundations of navigation, born long before maps were ever drawn. By 50,000 years ago, the descendants of Africa's wanderers stood on the shores of Southeast Asia, staring east across an ocean of islands. They had crossed half the planet. The lands behind them were known, those ahead, unimaginable. To the north lay China and the mountains of ice. To the south and east lay a blue horizon, empty, endless, calling. No one could have known that beyond that horizon lay Sahul, the last great continent unclaimed by humankind. Yet something in them stirred again, the same spark that had driven their ancestors across deserts and rivers. It was the same question whispered by wind and wave. What lies beyond? They would soon find out. The greatest migration in human history was about to enter its most daring chapter. When modern humans left Africa, they did not step into an empty world. The Earth then was still shared among several species of our genus, human in form but different in face, voice, and destiny. To the west and north roamed the Neanderthals, masters of the Ice Age cold. In the high mountains of Asia lived the Denisovans, shadowy cousins whose bones were few but whose legacy would echo in our blood. Farther east, on islands like Flores, lived the tiny hobbits, Homo floresiensis, survivors from a deeper, stranger time. For tens of millennia, the planet was not ruled by one humanity but many. Yet only one would endure. The encounters between these different human worlds were among the most profound and mysterious moments in prehistory. They shaped our genes, our minds, and perhaps even our myths. Though the evidence today comes from mere fragments, a jawbone in Tibet, a finger in Siberia, a tool buried under volcanic ash. Together they reveal a chapter of contact, conflict, and connection that forever changed what it meant to be human. The Neanderthals were first. When Homo sapiens reached the Near East and Europe around 60,000 years ago, they met a people who had already been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Stocky, strong, and adapted to cold, Neanderthals had culture and skill. They hunted mammoth and rhinoceros. They made tools with precision and buried their dead with care. They were not beasts, they were kin. The first meetings may have been cautious, even hostile. Two intelligent predators competing for the same resources rarely coexist peacefully. Perhaps there were skirmishes over hunting grounds, raids for food or mates. Yet, somehow, across those divides, there were also moments of intimacy. Bones from caves in France and Croatia tell of mixed ancestry. The genomes of both species now confirm it. Love, or at least union, crossed the boundary. In those nights of fire and frost, the first hybrid children were born. Neither Neanderthal nor fully modern, but something between. These children, if they survived, carried new combinations of genes that proved useful. From Neanderthals, modern humans inherited stronger immune systems, resistance to cold, and perhaps even traits in our skin and hair. The legacy remains small, invisible, but real. Even now, a fragment of their world moves within us. Farther east, another story unfolded, one even stranger. In the caves of the Altai Mountains in Siberia, scientists discovered a finger bone so tiny it could have been mistaken for a child's. Yet from its DNA came the revelation of an entirely different species, the Denisovans. They were close relatives of Neanderthals, but genetically distinct, and they had spread across Asia long before Homo sapiens arrived. Their traces appear in the highlands of Tibet, the forests of Indonesia, and the ancient gene pools of Papua New Guinea. To the first Homo sapiens who met them, the Denisovans must have seemed both alien and familiar. We do not know their faces, but we know their strength. One of their genetic gifts, a version of the EPAS1 gene, allows modern Tibetans to survive in thin mountain air. Without Denisovan DNA, the people of the Himalayas might never have thrived at such heights. Our survival, even today, is partly theirs. Yet as with the Neanderthals, these meetings were fleeting. Within a few thousand years, both species vanished. Whether by climate, competition, or interbreeding, their distinct forms dissolved into ours. Their extinction was not a single event, but a slow absorption, a merging of worlds. We became, in a sense, the final sum of all humanity. In the islands of Southeast Asia, the encounters grew stranger still. On Flores, a tiny species had endured in isolation for over 1 million years. Homo floresiensis, the hobbits. Barely a meter tall with small brains but clever hands, They had hunted miniature elephants and giant storks long before Homo sapiens appeared. When the modern migrants arrived, the two species may have seen each other briefly, two branches of humanity meeting after an unimaginable separation. No one knows what happened next. Perhaps the hobbits were already fading, their numbers too few to survive the arrival of larger, faster newcomers. Perhaps they lingered in memory, transformed into legend, the Ebu Gogo of Florizon folklore, the little people who whispered in the forest. In their disappearance, we glimpse a truth that would echo throughout prehistory. Every time our species moved forward, another faded behind us. What drove this pattern? Was it violence, disease, or the quiet tyranny of competition? The answer is complex. Homo sapiens, with our flexible diets, advanced tools, and social cooperation, could outlast almost any rival. But there was something deeper: the power of culture. We could share knowledge across generations, tell stories that united hundreds of individuals under a common cause. Neanderthals had language, but Homo sapiens had myth. That difference, the ability to imagine and believe together, may have been the true weapon that conquered the world. Still, not all was triumph. Each encounter left traces of sorrow. Geneticists can now read the echoes of ancient bottlenecks, moments when our numbers nearly vanished. Even as we spread, the Earth was perilous. Volcanoes erupted, ice sheets advanced. Some bands died out entirely. Others survived by merging with the very species they met. The story of humanity was never pure. It was always hybrid. As Homo sapiens continued eastward, carrying fragments of all who came before, they entered lands no human had ever seen. The tropics of Southeast Asia teemed with sound: parrots, insects, monsoon rain. The dense jungles and mangrove coasts offered abundance, but also confusion. The newcomers adapted again, shaping tools from bamboo, hunting fish with bone-tipped spears, building shelters from palm leaves. Theirs was not just a migration. It was the invention of versatility. But at the farthest edge of this green labyrinth, the land ended. Ahead lay the sea, a glittering expanse between the islands of Sunda and the unseen continent of Sahul. Behind them stretched thousands of kilometers of memory, full of ghosts and genes from all the human kinds they had met. They were now a single species forged by many fires. In their blood ran the endurance of Neanderthals, the strength of Denisovans, and the curiosity that no extinction could silence. They had inherited the wisdom of cooperation and the courage to face the unknown. The next step would demand all of it. To cross the oceans, they would have to trust in the very imagination that had led them this far. For beyond the last island lay a continent that no other human had reached, a place of red deserts, thunderbirds, and vast silence. It waited, untouched, on the far side of the sea. And so, somewhere around 50,000 years ago, perhaps under the glow of a rising moon, a group of humans looked east. The waves broke against the shore like the heartbeat of the planet. Children slept beside fires. Elders traced constellations in the sky, reading the winds. And someone, perhaps a woman, perhaps a man, pointed toward the horizon and whispered, "There is more." That whisper became a decision. That decision became a voyage. And that voyage became history. The ocean has always stood as the ultimate boundary of human imagination. To those who first looked upon it tens of thousands of years ago, it must have seemed endless. A moving mirror of sky and storm, unpredictable and alive. Yet, in this shimmering expanse, the ancestors of all coastal peoples would discover both a threat and a promise. The sea would test them. It would also transform them. Around 50,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens reached the easternmost fringe of Asia. Behind them lay the long trail of migration from Africa through India and Southeast Asia, a journey of tens of millennia. Ahead lay only the open ocean, broken by a scattered necklace of islands. The great landmass of Sahul, today's Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, was still invisible beyond the horizon, separated from the last islands of Sunda by channels of deep, fast-moving water. To cross them meant stepping into the unknown. But these humans were no longer the inexperienced wanderers of the savannah. They had evolved, not only biologically but culturally. The sea, once a barrier, had become a teacher. Over generations spent along tropical coasts and mangrove estuaries, they had learned to read its moods. They watched the tide's rhythm, the drift of clouds, and the direction of seabirds. They learned to predict currents from floating debris and to sense islands by the behavior of dolphins. This growing knowledge, passed through stories, songs, and observation, formed the first maritime tradition in human history. In this time, they built the world's first watercraft. No one can know exactly how these looked, for nothing of rope or wood has survived the ages. But experiments and ethnographic parallels offer clues. Some were rafts made of bamboo or logs bound with vines. Others may have been dugout canoes, their hulls carved by stone tools and fire. Even simple bundles of reeds could bear a person across rivers and inlets. Over generations, those crude craft grew more sophisticated, capable of carrying families, fires, and supplies across stretches of sea that had once been thought impassable. The idea of a mariner was being born, and with it, something new entered the human spirit: confidence in the unknown. Imagine a coastal camp on one of the islands now known as Sulawesi or Flores. The air smells of salt and resin. Children gather shells while adults carve logs and twist fibers into rope. The sea glows bronze under the evening sun. A small group prepares for a voyage. They carry obsidian blades, water gourds, and bundles of dried roots. They tie torches above their heads so the fires won't die in the night. They may not know what lies beyond, but they know how to find their way back. The pattern of stars overhead has become their compass. As darkness falls, they push the raft into the surf. For a moment the waves pull and resist, then release. The sea accepts them. To modernize, this moment marks a threshold as significant as the invention of fire. It is the dawn of intentional navigation. For the first time, humans crossed not by accident or drift, but by design. Archaeologists call this the Wallacean crossing, after the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who would later note that the deep water channels between the Indonesian islands form a biological divide even now. To cross those channels required skill, memory, and daring. It was, in essence, humanity's first experiment in exploration. And it succeeded. Across the islands of Wallacea, Flores, Timor, Alor, and beyond, archaeologists have found ancient tools, hearths, and pigments that tell a story of repeated human occupation. These were not random drifters swept by storms. They were communities that understood movement. They may have traveled seasonally, following the migration of fish or the flowering of certain plants. Each voyage would have carried not only people, but culture, songs, language, and technology, spreading like ripples through the archipelago. The ocean did not divide them, it connected them. For generations, these people must have lived between worlds, part land-dwelling hunter, part sailor. They harvested shellfish and sea turtles, learned to fish in deep waters, and crafted hooks from bone. They built floating fires on layers of clay to cook food during long crossings. They followed the glow of bioluminescent waves and the path of constellations. What began as survival became tradition. What began as risk became ritual. This maritime life also changed their thinking. The sea demanded planning, cooperation, and trust. No one could cross alone. It required groups, builders, navigators, leaders, and storytellers to work as one. In that cooperation lay the roots of civilization itself. The same coordination that would one day build cities was first learned on these simple rafts of bamboo and vine. Modern experiments help us understand just how extraordinary this was. At the Australian National University, scientists have attempted to reconstruct possible prehistoric voyages using only materials available at the time. They built rafts of bamboo, lashed them with natural fibers, and tested their seaworthiness. The result was astonishing. With skilled navigation, such vessels could indeed travel the required distances, over 80 kilometers of open sea, carrying entire families. The crossing to Sahul, once dismissed as impossible, proved to be within reach of Stone Age ingenuity. It may not have been done in one generation. The migration could have unfolded in waves, some journeys failing, others succeeding, each leaving behind stories that guided the next attempt. Over time, these stories became maps, passed through memory rather than parchment. The names of islands, winds, and stars may have been sung in rhythms that helped sailors recall their order. Language itself may have evolved, partly through the need to navigate, to describe direction, distance, and destiny. And so, in the hands and voices of these early mariners, humanity became truly global. The same impulse that had driven them from Africa now carried them beyond the sight of land. But there was always danger. The sea, beautiful as it was, could turn deadly without warning. Sudden squalls could shatter a raft. Currents could carry travelers far from shore. Those who vanished became legends. The spirits of the sea mourned in whispers. Others returned bearing tales of distant lands, strange animals, and glowing skies. For those who survived, each crossing deepened their bond with the ocean. They were no longer merely people who lived beside it. They belonged to it. In this way, the first sailors forged an identity older than any nation, the identity of the explorer. Their courage would echo in every voyage that followed, from the Polynesian navigators of the Pacific to the great ships of the modern age. Every mast, every compass, every chart traces its lineage back to those nameless voyagers who first dared to push beyond the edge of the known world. By the time they reached the last islands, Timor, Roti, or Alor, they had already achieved what no other creature had ever done: the conscious crossing of deep ocean. Yet the greatest leap still lay ahead. The final stretch of water to Sahul was wider than all the rest. Beyond it lay a vast continent untouched by human feet, its coasts teeming with giant reptiles, marsupials, and birds. No one could see it, but perhaps they sensed it, smelled its storms, watched its cloud banks gather on the horizon. The sea itself seemed to beckon, whispering of a world waiting to be claimed. They would answer that call soon enough. The last fire flickered on the shore as preparations began. Tools were sharpened, food dried, ropes inspected. The ocean murmured under a full moon, its silver light tracing a path across the waves, a path that led toward destiny. Somewhere in that darkness, the first sailors of humankind pushed their rafts into the surf once more. Behind them lay Africa's memory. Ahead of them lay Australia's dawn. And between them stretched the greatest unknown of all. The chain of islands stretching between Asia and Australia was a world in itself, an archipelago forged by fire and sculpted by time. Volcanoes rose from the sea like sleeping gods, their peaks draped in mist. Earthquakes shook the ground with a low, living growl. Between eruptions, lush forests reclaimed the lava, turning black stone to green paradise. But for the early humans who journeyed through this world, beauty came with danger. To cross Wallacea, the ancient realm between Sunda and Sahul, meant facing the Earth's rawest power. Here, the line between land and sea blurred. Rivers poured molten ash into the ocean. Coral reefs sparkled beneath crystal shallows, while deep channels cut like scars through the seafloor. To reach Australia, these travelers would have to pass through this chaotic landscape, stepping stones floating on the edge of two worlds. Each island offered both refuge and risk. Archaeologists have pieced together fragments of this journey from clues scattered across these islands. On Sulawesi, they found cave paintings of animals, warty pigs and dwarf buffalo, dated to more than 45,000 years ago. The ochre lines curve with grace, drawn by hands that already understood beauty. To the south, on Timor and Alor, the remains of deep-sea fish show that humans here were not only hunters, but skilled fishermen. They were adapting, mastering the islands one by one. And yet, among these signs of progress lies another mystery, a shadow from an earlier age. On the island of Flores, in the cool depths of Liangbua Cave, scientists uncovered the bones of beings both familiar and strange. They were tiny, no more than a meter tall, with brains the size of grapefruits, but tools as sharp as any made by early humans. They walked upright, hunted, and used fire. These were Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of prehistory. The discovery stunned the world. How could such a small species survive alongside modern humans? And did our ancestors ever meet them? The evidence suggests that they did, or at least that they could have. Around 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were moving through the same region, island by island. The bones of the hobbits show that they lived until roughly the same time. For a brief moment in history, the islands may have echoed with two kinds of human laughter, two sets of footprints in the same volcanic dust. Imagine the encounter. The newcomers, taller and more numerous, their fires blazing bright against the night. The island's original inhabitants, small but swift, watching from the shadows. Did they trade? Did they fight? Did they simply pass each other like ghosts across time? No one knows. But legends from Flores speak of the Ibugogo, little people who stole food, mimicked human speech, and vanished into the forest when threatened. To some anthropologists, these stories may be cultural memories, passed down through countless generations from an age when multiple human species truly shared the world. If so, the meeting on Flores was one of the last chapters in an ancient story, the coexistence of many human kinds. Soon after, Homo floresiensis disappeared. Whether they perished through competition, climate, or simple chance, their loss marked another step toward our species' solitude. From this point on, Homo sapiens would walk the earth alone. But even as the hobbits vanished, their land remained a crucible of creation. The islands of Wallacea forced adaptation. Each new shore meant new tools, new diets, new challenges. Bamboo replaced stone as a material. Shells became ornaments and blades. The rhythm of the tides taught patience. Volcanic ash taught renewal. For the voyagers, this journey was not just a crossing. It was evolution in motion. To survive here, they had to understand both fire and stone. Fire gave warmth and light, but it also gave warning. When volcanoes erupted, fire fell from the sky, blanketing the forests in darkness. Yet from that destruction came fertile soil, and from soil came life. The travelers learned to read the earth's moods, the tremble before an eruption, the stillness before a storm. They learned when to move, when to stay, and when to rebuild. At night, as the mountains glowed red in the distance, the people gathered by their own small fires to tell stories. The ocean thundered beyond the reefs, but in their songs it became a friend, a spirit that connected rather than divided. Their myths may have spoken of islands born from dragon's breath, of ancestors turned to stone, of gods who carried light across the water. Through these tales they gave meaning to a world that could both feed and kill them. And then came the final sea. From the southern islands of Timor and Roti, the voyagers looked out upon the broadest stretch of water they had ever seen. The far shore was invisible. Sahul lay hidden beyond the curve of the earth. To cross it meant leaving everything behind: the islands, the memories, perhaps even the gods. It was the last and greatest leap. Scientists estimate that this crossing required at least 80 to 100 kilometers of open ocean travel, an astonishing distance for people without metal tools or written navigation. Yet remarkably, they did it. How? Theories abound. Some believe they waited for seasonal winds that blew steadily eastward, building larger rafts capable of carrying entire families. Others suggest multiple journeys, guided by cloud patterns and bird migrations. Some voyages may have failed, their rafts lost to storms. But others must have succeeded, for footprints still mark the ancient dunes of Australia's northern coast. One powerful clue lies in the geography of these islands. From certain vantage points, perhaps a high volcano or cliff, the clouds over Sahul might have been visible on clear days, a faint promise on the horizon. Perhaps the voyagers saw lightning flashing far away and believed it was the spirit of a new land calling them. Or perhaps they simply trusted the pattern of migration, the instinct of birds, the drift of floating seeds, to tell them that land lay beyond. Whatever the reason, they launched into the unknown. The journey across the Timor Sea was not one of hours, but of days. The sea could rise suddenly, its calm broken by towering waves. Salt stung the skin. The wind howled like an ancient voice. Children cried. Adults sang to keep rhythm with the paddles. They followed the stars, the constellations that moved predictably across the night sky, turning the heavens into their map. Each dawn was a test of faith. Then, one morning, perhaps after 3, perhaps after 5 days, they saw it. A line on the horizon. Land. The waves grew shallower. The air changed scent, and birds began to circle overhead. The voyagers shouted, wept, laughed. Ahead lay a vast new continent of red cliffs and endless plains, a place that no human had ever seen. They had reached Sahul. Behind them, the volcanoes of Wallacea still smoked, guarding the secrets of their crossing. Before them stretched the wild heart of Australia, a world of strange creatures and unimaginable possibilities. In that moment, humanity became truly planetary. The ocean, once a wall, had become a bridge. Fire, stone, and courage had carried us farther than any species had ever gone. And though the names of those first mariners are lost forever, their legacy remains in every tide that meets the Australian shore. The islands of fire and stone faded behind them, swallowed by the sea. Ahead, the story of the first Australians was about to begin. Before them stretched the great unknown, an ocean without end, a restless blue plain that swallowed the sky. It shimmered under the tropical sun, vast and indifferent. For the first time in human history, a people stood at the edge of a world they could not see across. Behind them lay the smoking peaks of Wallacea, still trembling from the earth's fire. Ahead, beyond the curve of the horizon, was Sahul, the last continent untouched by human hands. Between them, the Timor Sea glimmered like molten glass, 100 kilometers of deep water with no visible shore. It was a barrier unlike any they had faced before. On land, they could adapt, learn, and recover. The sea offered no such mercy. Once the rafts left shore, there would be no turning back. Storms, currents, and hunger waited in the deep. To cross was to gamble everything: life, tribe, and memory. Yet somehow, they decided to go. What drove them? Necessity? Curiosity? Or something older? The same restlessness that had carried their ancestors from Africa's plains to the ends of the earth. Perhaps hunger pushed them, or the sight of cloud banks far to the east, an omen of land beyond sight, or perhaps it was faith, a belief that the world continued past the visible horizon. Whatever the reason, they prepared. The preparation itself was monumental. Unlike smaller island crossings, this voyage required knowledge passed down over generations. They had learned to build better rafts, longer, broader, bound with tougher vines, layered with bark to keep out water. They carried bundles of roots and smoked meat, gourds filled with fresh water, torches sealed in clay to protect their fire. Some rafts bore symbols carved into the wood, perhaps prayers or clan markings, calling upon spirits of wind and sea. They must have watched the tides and stars for days, waiting for the wind to shift in their favor. The sea was not random to them. It was a living map, a rhythm. When the tide rose highest and the wind blew steady from the west, they launched. Imagine the sound. Dozens of rafts creaking as they slid into the surf, shouts echoing over the waves. The air smelled of resin, smoke, and salt. Children clung to mothers. Dogs barked, fires flickered atop layers of clay. The rafts gathered beyond the breakers, then drifted eastward, the wind filling their makeshift sails of woven leaves. The journey had begun. By day, the sea glittered like a field of mirrors. Flying fish darted from the water. Clouds piled high on the horizon, marking storms in the distance. The voyagers watched the flight paths of seabirds, counting how long they disappeared before returning, a sign of how far land might lie. At night, the stars guided them. The constellations they had memorized along the coasts of Sulawesi and Timor became their compass. The Southern Cross rose higher each evening, pulling them toward a destiny none could yet imagine. But the sea is never constant. Currents turned against them, dragging the rafts apart. Winds screamed. Waves rose taller than trees, crashing down in white fury. The fires hissed and died. Smoke filled the air. People clung to each other, praying to ancestors and ocean spirits. Some rafts vanished into the darkness, their voices swallowed by the wind. Others pressed on, driven by desperation and courage. Days passed. The sun burned skin. The sun burned skin and eyes. Salt cracked lips. Water ran low. Some sang to keep rhythm, others whispered stories to stay awake. In the middle of that endless blue, the world must have felt infinite, and humanity impossibly small. Yet still, they did not turn back. Modern scientists have tried to imagine this crossing, but no experiment can truly capture its terror and beauty. In recent decades, researchers from the Australian National University built rafts from bamboo and vine, testing them against wind and current. They discovered that with skill and patience, such vessels could indeed survive open water for days, even weeks. The journey was possible, but only with teamwork and determination. These voyagers were not castaways. They were navigators. The sea had changed them. To cross it required foresight, planning for food, weather, and group survival. It demanded leadership and communication, the ability to keep unity under stress. These are not instincts. They are culture. The crossing of the Timor Sea may have been the first moment in which humanity relied not just on strength or tools, but on trust. Then, one morning, perhaps after 4 or 5 days, the horizon broke. At first it was a mirage, a faint shadow rising from the sea. Then it became real. Land. Sahul. They shouted, pointing. Joy and disbelief filled the air. After so much emptiness, the sight of trees, of cliffs, of smoke rising in the distance must have been overwhelming. The wind carried the scent of new soil and distant rain. They had made it. The first landfall was likely the northern coast of Australia, near what we now call Arnhem Land. There the beaches stretched red and gold beneath ancient cliffs. Freshwater streams wind through the mangroves. It was a place of abundance: crabs, fish, birds, roots. The voyagers dragged their rafts ashore and fell to their knees, touching the sand. The journey had ended. Or rather, something far greater had begun. From this moment forward, the story of humankind changed. No longer confined by continents, we had crossed into the realm of the oceans. The deep blue barrier had been broken. In doing so, humans proved that imagination was as powerful as evolution. The ability to believe in unseen land, to dream of what lay beyond, was as vital to survival as fire or stone. Behind them, the sea glittered in silence, as if erasing their path. Those who had perished would be remembered in stories, their spirits said to live in the waves or stars. Those who survived became the founders of a new world. They brought their languages, their tools, and their memories of distant islands. Their children would one day call this place home, and their descendants would carry its songs for 40,000 years. The beach where they landed may still bear the footprints of those first steps, fossilized in ancient mud, waiting for modern eyes to rediscover them. At sites like Majid Bebe, archaeologists have found evidence of their arrival: stone flakes, pigments, and hearths dating back at least 65 millennia. In those fragments lies proof of humanity's greatest leap, not just across geography, but across imagination itself. From Africa's cradle to Australia's shore, the journey had spanned half the planet. Along the way, we met and merged with other kinds of humans. We tamed fire, carved tools, painted stories, and dared to cross an ocean no creature had ever crossed. Now, standing beneath the blazing southern sun, the survivors looked upon a land unlike any other. Strange animals moved among the trees, creatures that hopped, slithered, or soared on wings they had never seen. The air shimmered with heat, filled with the calls of parrots and the cries of giant birds. They had reached the end of the world, but in truth, it was only the beginning of another. For in that moment, on a red shore beneath a white sky, the impossible had been done. Humanity had conquered the sea, and the world would never be the same again. For tens of millennia, the memory of that first crossing was preserved only in silence, in the genes of their descendants, in the red dust of their footprints, and in the whispers of wind across the northern coast of Australia. No written record could survive, no carved monument could endure. Yet the evidence lay waiting, hidden in the earth. And when modern science finally unearthed it, the story that emerged was more astonishing than anyone could have imagined. For centuries, scholars assumed that Australia's first inhabitants must have arrived by accident, perhaps carried on drifting logs or torn from shore by storms. The idea that Stone Age humans could plan a sea voyage across open water seemed impossible. But as archaeologists and geneticists began to piece together the puzzle, the truth proved far more extraordinary. It began with the land itself. Beneath the waves north of Australia lies a drowned continent, Sahul, once connected by low sea levels during the Ice Age. When glaciers locked away the world's water, the oceans fell by more than 100 meters, revealing wide plains between New Guinea, Australia, and Tasmania. Yet even at its lowest, a deep ocean trench, the Lombok Strait, still separated Sahul from the Asian mainland. To reach it, early humans had to cross not one but several channels of open sea. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scientists set out to test the theory that our ancestors had done so deliberately. In a series of experiments, researchers from the Australian National University and Griffith University built replicas of ancient rafts using only prehistoric tools, stone axes, fire, and plant fibers. They gathered bamboo, logs, and vines from the forests, lashed them together, and launched them into the same currents that flow today between Timor and northern Australia. What they found changed everything. Even the simplest rafts, if constructed with care, could remain afloat for weeks. Guided by prevailing winds and ocean currents, they could travel the necessary 80 to 100 kilometers in as little as 3 to 5 days. By following bird migrations and cloud formations, navigators could easily estimate the direction of land. The crossing, once thought miraculous, was revealed as a triumph of human intelligence and cooperation. To attempt such a journey required more than courage. It required culture. No single person could have done it alone. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, had to work together. Builders to craft the rafts, navigators to read the stars, hunters to supply food, elders to pass down the knowledge of winds and tides. The existence of that knowledge implies something profound, a language rich enough to teach, to plan, and to inspire. The voyage across the Timor Sea was not a desperate flight. It was the first great expedition in human history. Modern mapping has also revealed the route they likely took. From the Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, travelers moved through a corridor of islands: Borneo, Sulawesi, Timor, and finally the Arc of Islets leading to Sahul. Each stage was visible from the last, but the final crossing was not. The last horizon was blind, This means they left shore without seeing their destination, relying purely on faith in their knowledge and the memory of the sea. To visualize this, scientists used computer simulations combining ocean currents, wind directions, and boat speed. The results suggest that multiple voyages, spread over generations, could have carried entire populations to Australia. These were not isolated wanderers. They were founding migrations, organized, sustained, intentional. The evidence found on land supports this. At Majed Bebe, an archaeological site near Kakadu in northern Australia, stone tools, pigments, and hearths date back at least 65,000 years. Some layers even suggest an earlier presence, perhaps 70,000. Such early dates mean humans must have reached the continent long before the final Ice Age peak, perhaps even during one of the planet's warmer interglacial phases. That makes them the earliest known mariners in the world. Their arrival also left genetic fingerprints. Studies of Aboriginal Australian DNA reveal deep lineages, tracing back over 50,000 years with no significant outside input until recent centuries. These genes connect them not to Africa directly, but to a shared ancestor with the peoples of Papua New Guinea and parts of Indonesia, the echo of those first voyagers. In them, we find the living proof that the crossing was real, that it succeeded, and that its legacy endures in every heartbeat of Australia's first peoples. But how did they view their own journey? Science can measure distance and time, but not meaning. To understand what the crossing meant to them, we must look through the lens of culture. Among Aboriginal Australians today, the concept of the dreaming, or dream time, describes the time of creation, when ancestral beings shaped the world. In their songs and stories, the sea is not a boundary but a living force, a pathway between realms. Some traditions speak of ancestral heroes who came from across the water, guided by stars and spirit winds. These myths, preserved for tens of thousands of years, may contain distant memories of the first crossing, the moment when the ocean opened and humanity stepped into a new world. Even in the language itself, traces remain. Linguists studying ancient Australian dialects have found words that connect navigation with kinship, as though direction and family were intertwined. To move across the land or sea was not just to travel, it was to follow the path of ancestors, to remain part of the great story of creation. The voyage that modern scientists call a migration may, to its participants, have been something far more profound, a sacred journey of becoming. Modern reconstruction cannot restore their voices, but it can bring us closer to their world. When researchers paddle bamboo rafts into the sunrise, they feel the same wind, see the same stars, and hear the same waves that once guided the first Australians. In that moment, the line between past and present blurs. The ocean that once divided continents becomes a mirror, reflecting the continuity of human courage. The success of these ancient navigators reshaped more than geography. It reshaped destiny. Once we had conquered the sea, no environment was beyond reach. From this moment onward, the human story would be one of movement, adaptation, and imagination. The crossing to Sahul marked the birth of the explorer's instinct, the same impulse that would one day send Polynesians across the Pacific, Vikings across the Atlantic, and astronauts beyond Earth's sky. And yet, for all our modern achievements, none surpass the courage of those first mariners. With no metal, no maps, and no written words, they crossed an ocean of uncertainty guided only by memory and belief. They did not know the world was round. They did not know they would survive, but they went anyway. When they stepped ashore on the far side of the sea, humanity itself was transformed. For the first time, we had proven that imagination could shape destiny, that the invisible could become real through faith and action. The waves rolled gently against the red sand of northern Australia. The ocean behind them glittered like a dream, erasing the path they had taken. The people built fires, gathered food, and began to explore. They had left one world behind and found another, a world that would hold their descendants for more than 40,000 years. And so, the impossible ocean was crossed, not by gods or machines, but by ordinary humans whose courage rewrote the boundaries of the possible. The waves broke against a red shoreline. Above them, a sky of blinding blue stretched to infinity. For the voyagers who had just survived the crossing, the land before them must have seemed a miracle, vast, silent, and alive with strange sounds. They had reached the continent of Sahul, the ancient landmass that joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania before the rising seas of later ages tore them apart. This was a new world, untouched by any human footstep. As they stepped ashore, history changed. For the first time, humanity had crossed into a completely isolated continent. No other primate, no other hominin, no other creature remotely like us had ever stood here. The air smelled of eucalyptus and salt. The sand burned beneath their feet. Giant dragonflies shimmered over lagoons. Kangaroos, creatures unlike anything seen in Asia, hopped cautiously through the brush. The first Australians had no word for this land, yet they would come to know it better than any people would ever know theirs. Archaeological traces mark their arrival like echoes through time. At a place called Majid Bebe, deep in Arnhem Land, stone tools and pigments lie buried beneath layers of sand, some dating back at least 65,000 years. The charcoal of ancient fires, flakes of sharpened stone, and beads of ground ochre all tell the same story. They came, they survived, and they thrived. Their footprints, too, have been found, etched into ancient mud at sites such as Lake Mungo and Willandra Lakes. These fossilized steps, small and large, frozen in time, show groups of families walking together, men, women, children, moving inland from the sea. They were not wanderers lost on a shore. They were settlers. Their migration had ended. Their civilization had begun. The world they entered was breathtaking, but it was also dangerous. The continent teemed with megafauna, creatures so vast they seemed almost mythical. There were diprotodons, lumbering marsupial giants the size of a car. Procoptodon, kangaroos 3 meters tall that moved with thunderous grace. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion with slicing teeth that could shear bone. And enormous flightless birds like Geniornis, nicknamed the demon duck of doom. These animals had never seen humans before. To them, the strange new bipeds with fire and tools were merely another species in the landscape. But to the newcomers, this abundance was both opportunity and a trial. They would have to learn the rhythms of the land, when to hunt, when to rest, and how to survive a climate that could shift from flood to drought within a season. Fire became their most powerful ally. The travelers carried embers from the coasts into the interior, using it to clear undergrowth and flush out game. In time, they began to burn deliberately, not in chaos, but in cycles. They learned that by burning old grasses after the rains, new growth would attract kangaroos and wallabies. Over generations, this fire stick farming reshaped the Australian environment, turning dense forests into open savannas. Humans became architects of ecology, bending the land to their rhythm. But even in this age of abundance, survival required imagination. The interior of Australia, its deserts and salt plains, was unlike any environment humans had known. There were few rivers, and seasons were unpredictable. To move inland, they needed to know where water could be found: hidden springs, underground wells, desert plants that held moisture in their roots. Such knowledge could only come through patience, memory, and teaching. In this crucible of extremes, culture became as essential as food or fire. Every lesson had to be remembered, every path memorized. Knowledge was survival, and memory became sacred. In this, the seeds of one of the world's oldest continuous cultures began to grow. The early Australians adapted not just physically but spiritually. They began to see the land as alive, a living network of ancestors, spirits, and forces. Rivers, mountains, and animals all carried meaning. This way of seeing the world would later be known as the dreaming or dream time, a cosmic map connecting all life. But even in its earliest form, it shaped how people interacted with their surroundings. They did not see themselves as masters of the land, but as part of it. Their art was the first language of this connection. In caves and on cliff faces, they painted figures of animals, humans, and spirits. The pigments, red, yellow, and white ochre, came from the earth itself. These early paintings, some over 40,000 years old, are among humanity's oldest surviving artworks. They depict not just what they saw, but what they believed. The creatures that loomed in their myths, the rainbow serpent, the giant birds, the ancestral hunters, may have been inspired by real encounters with the megafauna that roamed their world. In the soft light of their fires, these paintings glowed as if alive. They were not decorations. They were stories, maps of knowledge and faith. Meanwhile, life along the coasts flourished. The sea, once their greatest challenge, became their greatest provider. Fish, shellfish, and sea turtles sustained entire communities. They crafted hooks from bone, nets from plant fiber, and boats from bark. The same ingenuity that had carried them across the Timor Sea now served them in daily life. And slowly, over thousands of years, they spread across the continent. From the tropical north to the cool forests of Tasmania, humans adapted to every climate. In New Guinea's highlands, they cultivated yams and taro, creating some of the earliest forms of agriculture on Earth. In the desert heart of Australia, they developed nomadic routes that followed the rains. They sang the paths as they walked, turning geography into melody. To travel, they followed songlines, oral maps encoded in rhythm and myth. Each verse described a waterhole, a landmark, or a direction. To sing a songline was to navigate. To remember it was to survive. In this way, music became both compass and scripture. The crossing to Sahul had not just expanded human geography, it had transformed human consciousness. On this continent, separated from the rest of the world, humans and land became one story. Over time, their numbers grew, and their cultures diversified into hundreds of languages, each rooted in the same ancestral memory. The journey across the sea, the first footprints on red sand, the gift of fire and song. Yet even as they thrived, the great beasts began to vanish. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of the megafauna were gone. Some blame climate shifts, others human hunting or burning. But whatever the cause, their disappearance changed everything. Without the giant grazers, the ecosystems evolved anew. The people adapted again, refining their tools, altering their movements, finding balance in a changing world. Still, they remembered. In their myths, the ghosts of those vanished creatures lingered, giant kangaroos that became mountains, great birds turned to stars, and lions that sank into stone. Their memory lived not in bones but in stories, passed from generation to generation, echoing down 40 millennia. So began the age of the first Australians, the age when humans became part of the dreaming of the land itself. Standing on the cliffs of Arnhem Land, the descendants of those first voyagers must have looked back at the horizon their ancestors had crossed. The ocean was still there, vast and gleaming. The winds still sang the same song. But now, the people who listened were no longer wanderers. They were home. The journey across the world was over. The journey into time had begun. Long before the first pyramids rose in Egypt or the first seeds were sown in Mesopotamia, another civilization, ancient beyond measure, had already begun to dream beneath the southern stars. It was a civilization without walls, kings, or temples, yet it would endure longer than any empire ever would. The first Australians had entered their land of giants, and from that meeting of humankind and megafauna, myth was born. The continent they called home was unlike any other. In its forests and deserts roamed creatures from an earlier Earth, enormous marsupials, towering birds, reptiles large enough to crush trees beneath their bellies. For these newcomers, each encounter was both awe and danger. They hunted, observed, and finally remembered, until reality merged with imagination and the creatures of bone and sinew became the ancestors of legend. The greatest of them all was Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived. Weighing nearly 3 tons, it resembled a wombat the size of a rhinoceros. Slow but immense, it grazed on shrubs and eucalyptus leaves. To humans armed with fire and stone-tipped spears, Diprotodon was both feast and challenge. A single kill could feed an entire band, but its defense, a swing of a limb heavy as a tree trunk, could crush a hunter in an instant. Some archaeologists believe the people followed herds of Diprotodon across the plains, timing their migrations with the rains. As generations passed, the memories of those hunts blurred into something deeper. Around ancient fires, storytellers described giant beings that walked the land before the coming of men. Creatures of spirit and muscle, half gods, half animals. When the last Diprotodon disappeared, its shadow remained, reborn in the dreamtime as the bunyip, the great water spirit of billabongs and rivers. There was also Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, smaller than a modern lion but armed with slicing teeth so sharp they could cut through bone. Its fossils reveal claw marks in caves, suggesting it may have dragged prey into darkness. For the early people, Thylacoleo must have been both terror and teacher. Some rock engravings show lion-like figures with clawed hands, perhaps the first artistic echoes of this predator. In their myths, creatures like it became guardians of forbidden places, spirits that punished arrogance or greed. And above them all ruled the sky's ancient monarch, the enormous flightless bird Genyornis newtoni, towering 2 meters tall with a beak like an axe. Some scientists believe its eggs were once a precious food source for humans. Burned shells found in dunes suggest cooking fires from 47,000 years ago. But hunting and climate change doomed the species, and its thunderous call fell silent. Yet, in Aboriginal oral traditions, echoes remain of colossal birds known as the mihurung, thunderbirds, that brought storms and lightning in their wings. Even the reptiles of this land were mythic. In the billabongs and rivers lurked crocodiles larger than any alive today, and in the dry plains, fossils tell of Megalania, a giant lizard 7 meters long, a cousin of the Komodo dragon, a living nightmare of scale and fang. Though it vanished long ago, its essence endured. In the dreaming, stories that would later spread across the continent, Megalania became the rainbow serpent, the cosmic being who carved rivers and mountains as it moved through the earth. The line between myth and memory blurred until they were inseparable. For tens of thousands of years, these stories were not fantasy, they were knowledge wrapped in metaphor. Through them, each generation learned where to find water, when to move, how to respect the cycles of the land. The dream time was not long ago. It was always. In it, every place, every creature, every human life was connected by an invisible thread of creation. As the great beasts disappeared, the people mourned them not as lost prey, but as ancestors who had returned to the earth. Some traditions describe the spirits of the giants sleeping beneath the ground, waiting to rise again when the world is renewed. Even today, in certain rock shelters, ochre paintings depict creatures that science recognizes as extinct thousands of years ago, painted, perhaps, by those who still remembered them. The extinction of the megafauna remains one of the great debates in science. Was it humanity's hunting that tipped the balance, or the shifting climate at the end of the Ice Age? The evidence tells a complex story. Around 45,000 years ago, as humans spread across Australia, the climate began to dry. Grasslands turned to scrub, waterholes vanished, and the great herds dwindled. Yet burn marks and hunting tools found alongside fossil bones hint that human activity accelerated their fall. Whether by spear or by fire, our ancestors helped close the Age of Giants. But in ending it, they also began something else, the Age of Story. The people who once hunted Diprotodon now painted its spirit on stone. The predators that once stalked them became divine teachers. The thunder of hooves and wings turned into drumbeats in song and ceremony. In their art, the Australians preserved not only what they saw but what they understood, that life and death were part of one endless dreaming. At night, around flickering campfires, the elders would tell of how the world began. In the beginning, they said, the earth was flat and sleeping. Then the great serpent awoke and moved through the land, carving rivers with its body, raising mountains with its coils. Where it paused, water sprang up. Where it fought, thunder rolled. To modern ears it sounds poetic, but to them it was instruction, an oral map. Each twist of the serpent's body marked a real river, each resting place a real spring. The dreaming united geography, history, and belief into one living system of knowledge. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that the birth of the Dreamtime itself was inspired by the awe of meeting those vanished giants. When the last of them disappeared, their presence survived in spirit, becoming the foundation of a worldview that saw time not as a line, but as a circle. The dreaming was a way of keeping the world alive by remembering it. Archaeologists still find traces of this ancient memory written in ochre on stone walls, human figures dancing beside massive, bird-like creatures, hunters chasing giant kangaroos under painted suns. Some of these images, dated to over 40,000 years old, may be the oldest storytelling ever recorded by human hands. Each brushstroke is a bridge between reality and myth, between what was and what is imagined. Standing in those caves today, scientists shine their lights across the crimson surfaces, tracing lines that once flickered in firelight. They realize they are not just looking at art, they are looking at humanity's first attempt to explain the unknown. By the time the Megafauna were gone, the people of Sahul had become something the world had never seen before, an isolated, self-sustaining civilization rooted entirely in oral history. For 40,000 years, they would preserve their past not in books or buildings, but in song, dance, and story. The land itself was their scripture, the dreamtime their library. And so the great beasts lived on, not in flesh but in memory. Their bones turned to stone, but their spirits became part of every sunrise, every river, every cloud. To walk across the red desert was to walk among ancestors. To speak of the giants was to keep the world awake. The age of giants had ended, but the age of dreaming had begun, and through it, the story of humanity itself would endure. The first Australians did not simply survive, they began to create. Out of the dust and silence of Sahul, they wove one of humanity's oldest tapestries of culture. A world where every rock, every tree, every cloud was alive with meaning. Long before the rise of the Sumerians or the sculptors of Egypt, these people were already shaping symbols of identity, faith, and memory in a continent that seemed infinite. When they looked upon the land, they did not see wilderness. They saw story. Each mountain was the body of an ancestor. Each river was a songline, carved by a being whose journey had given birth to the world. The earth itself was sacred text, written not in ink, but in stone, wind, and fire. This vision gave birth to what would later be called the dreaming, or dreamtime, though neither word captures its true depth. To the first peoples it was not a myth or a time long past, it was the living foundation of existence. In the dreaming, the ancestors, the great beings who created the world, still lived, shaping the patterns of life and death. Time was not linear, but circular. The past was always present, and the present forever connected to the beginning. From this cosmology arose art, the first visible expression of belief. The cliffs and caves of northern and western Australia still bear witness. In the Kimberley region, paintings of delicate human forms stretch across ancient rock ceilings. In Kakadu, ochre images of animals and spirits glow in layers, each generation adding its mark atop the last, creating a visual dialogue that spans 30,000 years. These are not mere decorations. They are portals between worlds. Some depict the Wangina, cloud and rain spirits with round faces and large unblinking eyes. Others show elongated beings with swirling limbs, the Mimi spirits, said to have taught humans how to paint. Each figure tells a story of creation, of moral law, of the invisible threads that bind the natural and spiritual worlds. The pigments came from the earth itself, red and yellow ochre, white clay, charcoal, and manganese. The act of grinding and mixing these colors was itself ritual, an invocation of the land's power. To paint was to speak with the ancestors, to remember what the world once was. The first Australian artists were also the world's first theologians. Their work captured not only what they saw, but what they felt, the mystery of existence. Through image, they expressed concepts that had no words: the birth of rain, the cycle of death, the dance between humans and the spirit world. And always there was song, Music for the first Australians was language woven with breath. With the invention of the didgeridoo, one of the oldest wind instruments known, came the voice of the earth itself. Its low drone echoed the rumble of thunder, the pulse of life. Rhythmic clapping sticks and skin drums kept time with the movements of dancers who reenacted the deeds of the dreaming ancestors. In those dances, they were not imitating, they were becoming. To perform a ceremony was not to remember history, it was to relive it. In the dreaming worldview, every ritual reawakens the universe. When people sing, the world sings with them. When they dance, mountains and rivers remember their own birth. This unity between body, sound, and spirit made culture inseparable from survival. Even language reflected this sacred complexity. Across Australia, hundreds of distinct tongues emerged, each rooted in its landscape. A single word might carry layers of meaning, place, kinship, morality, and spirit intertwined. Through speech, humans maintained a relationship with their environment. To forget a word was not merely to lose vocabulary, it was to lose a piece of the world. The oral tradition became the vessel of immortality. Elders passed stories to children by firelight, ensuring that no drought, war, or death could erase knowledge. In a world without writing, memory was the greatest treasure. The brain itself became the archive of a people's entire civilization. Archaeologists studying early Australian life often remark on its astonishing stability. For over 40 millennia, the core traditions changed little. The tools evolved, the art styles shifted, but the worldview, the dreaming, remained. This constancy defies every rule of history. Civilizations elsewhere rose and fell in the span of centuries. Dynasties came and vanished. Yet here, in the heart of Sahul, one culture endured through ice ages, sea rises, and countless generations. Why? Because their culture was not built on conquest or architecture. It was built on relationship between people, land, and spirit. While empires of the north fought to control the earth, the first Australians sought harmony with it. Their cities were networks of memory, their cathedrals, the open sky. To the outsider, such a world may seem simple. In truth, it was profoundly complex. Every ceremony, every hunting ground, every waterhole was part of a system of rights and obligations, of songlines that could stretch hundreds of kilometers. These invisible paths connected clans across the continent. Following them, a person could navigate vast distances, guided not by maps, but by melody. To travel a songline was a sacred act. Each verse named a landmark. Each rhythm matched the terrain. To sing it was to keep the land alive. Elders said that if people stopped singing, the earth itself would fade. Thus, culture was not mere tradition. It was ecological maintenance, the spiritual stewardship of creation. In this sense, the first Australians were not only the world's first mariners and artists, they were also the first environmental philosophers. Long before modern science spoke of ecosystems, they had already understood that all things are connected, and that survival depends on balance. By the time European civilizations would one day rise in distant lands, the people of Sahul had already refined their ways of knowing into something timeless. Their calendars were written in the stars. Their law was encoded in story. Their map was sung across generations. And their art, painted in ochre, carved in stone, sung in the wind, still endures. In remote shelters, under layers of dust, the faces of Wangina spirits gaze out, serene and eternal. Scientists can date the pigments, measure the carbon, analyze the minerals, but they cannot measure meaning. That belongs to the people who still remember. Through them, the dreaming lives on. It is easy to forget, in the modern world of cities and machines, that once the human heart beat in rhythm with rain and thunder. Yet, somewhere, in the silence of the Australian bush, a songline still whispers through the grass. A song older than pyramids, older than the stars we named. And in that song lies the first truth of humanity's soul. We are not separate from the world. We are the world, dreaming of itself. Fire was humanity's first great invention, and in Australia, it became something even greater, a language between people and the land. For the first Australians, fire was not merely a tool. It was a living being, a spirit with moods and laws. They called it by many names, spoke to it in ritual, and used it to shape one of the most unique landscapes on Earth. Long before the first farmers tilled the soil of the Fertile Crescent, the people of Sahul were already engineering ecosystems with flame. Across vast plains and forests, they practiced what modern science now calls fire stick farming, controlled burns carried out with purpose and precision. To them, it was not farming as we know it, but a form of renewal. The flames cleared dead brush, returned nutrients to the soil, and summoned new growth. When the green shoots came, so did the kangaroos, wallabies, and emus. The land, reborn in fire, gave back its abundance. Every region developed its own rhythm of burning, timed to the seasons and the winds. In the north, fires were lit during the early dry months when grasses still held moisture, creating gentle blazes that crept slowly across the savanna. In the deserts of the interior, smaller patch burns ensured that no great inferno could rage out of control. To burn too much or too late was taboo, an act that angered both the ancestors and the earth. Modern ecologists now recognize this practice as one of the earliest and most effective forms of environmental management. Through millennia of careful fire use, the first Australians maintained a mosaic of habitats, grasslands, forests, wetlands, all interwoven like the threads of a living tapestry. The landscape we think of today as wild Australia was, in truth, a masterpiece of human stewardship. Archaeological charcoal layers reveal the scale of their knowledge. In some regions, patterns of burning can be traced back 40,000 years, showing continuity unmatched anywhere else on the planet. The people understood that to care for the land was to care for themselves. Their fires were prayers as much as tools, acts of gratitude that kept the balance between destruction and creation. In their mythology, fire had divine origins. Many dreaming stories tell of ancestral beings who brought flame to humanity. One legend speaks of two women who stole fire from the sky and hid it in a tree, teaching their people how to draw sparks from bark and stone. Another tells of the firehawk, a bird that carried burning sticks in its claws, spreading flames to flush out prey, an image now confirmed by modern zoology. Raptors in Australia have indeed been observed intentionally spreading fires to hunt escaping animals, echoing stories told for countless generations. For the first peoples, such stories were not metaphors. They were instructions. They explained not only why fire existed, but how it should be used. Myth and ecology were one. At dusk, as the last sunlight faded, families gathered around small, carefully tended flames. The fire's circle was both hearth and cosmos, the center of warmth, light, and storytelling. Around it, elders recited the laws of the land. Children listened, and the spirits of ancestors were believed to join in the dance of sparks. To watch fire was to watch life itself, eternal and fragile. The people learned to travel with fire, carrying smoldering sticks wrapped in bark as they moved between camps. Fire was never abandoned. It was kept alive, passed from one generation to the next. To let it die was shameful, a sign of neglect or ignorance. In this way, flame became lineage, connecting the living to their forebears, as surely as song or blood. Even death was marked by fire. When a great elder passed, smoke carried their spirit upward, joining the ancestors in the realm of the sky. The burning of wood and leaves was not destruction, it was transformation. Ash returned to soil, spirit to air, and the cycle continued. Over tens of thousands of years, the ecological consequences of this practice were profound. Entire plant species evolved to depend on fire for germination. Seeds of eucalyptus, banksia, and spinifex open only after exposure to heat. Animals too adapted. Kangaroos thrived in new grasslands. Emus nested in the edges of recently burned scrub, and predators followed the trails of rebirth. Where modern fires rage with devastation, Aboriginal fires whispered through the land like breath. Surgical, purposeful, alive. To outsiders, this might seem accidental, but it was science born of observation. The people studied wind direction, humidity, and terrain with the precision of meteorologists. They knew that smoke rising straight meant safety, while smoke twisting in spirals warned of danger. They could predict rainfall by the scent of the soil and gauge drought by the song of insects. Fire, in their hands, became the earliest instrument of climate management. Even their language reflected its importance. Words for fire were often the same as words for home, family, or heart. In some dialects, the word for woman shared a root with keeper of flame, recognizing the role of women in tending the hearth and teaching its laws. Through fire, gender, culture, and environment were bound in unity. The dreaming expanded to include these lessons. Stories told of beings who burned the land carelessly, creating deserts as punishment for arrogance. Others described heroes who rekindled fire after great floods, restoring balance to the world. In these tales lay warnings, ecological ethics disguised as myth. To live rightly meant to burn rightly. When European explorers arrived tens of thousands of years later, they were astonished by the park-like landscapes they found. Open woodlands, fertile plains, and orderly bands of vegetation. They believed they had discovered untouched wilderness. In truth, they were walking through the gardens of the world's oldest gardeners. But the fire had done more than shape forests. It had shaped minds. It taught patience, observation, and respect. It gave rhythm to life, the yearly burning, the regrowth, the harvest, the storytelling. Every flicker of flame was a reminder that death feeds life, that endings and beginnings are the same. At night, when the wind turned cool and the stars rose bright above the desert, the land itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the crackle of fire. Sparks drifted upward, joining the Milky Way, the emu in the sky, whose dark form mirrored the bird that roamed the plains below. 2. The people. This was no coincidence. The stars and the earth were reflections of each other. Fire connected them both, the flame below, the fire above. Through this connection, the first Australians became the custodians of an entire continent. Their philosophy was simple yet profound. The land owns us as much as we own the land. Fire was the handshake in that eternal agreement, And so, for 40 millennia, the cycle continued. The forests burned and grew again. The deserts sang in color after the rains. People moved with the seasons, carrying fire and memory wherever they went. The harmony held, until strangers arrived who did not understand the old ways, and the balance began to break. But for now, in this ancient age of the dreaming, the fire still burned as it always had, gently, wisely, endlessly. Its glow flickered across painted cave walls, illuminating faces both mortal and divine. The flames whispered to the wind, and the wind carried their stories across the sleeping land. In that shimmering light, humanity's oldest covenant was written. We are made of earth and flame. To keep the fire alive is to keep the world alive. The land that had once welcomed humanity with abundance began to turn against them. After thousands of years of relative stability, the skies of Sahul shifted. The rains grew unpredictable. Rivers thinned and vanished into sand. Lakes that once mirrored the stars became empty bowls of cracked earth. The green world of the early dreaming slowly transformed into one of fire, dust, and silence. This was the long dry, a climatic upheaval that tested the endurance of every living thing. It was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow tightening of the world's breath, a drought that deepened across centuries. For the people of Australia, survival meant adaptation, not through conquest, but through wisdom. At the beginning, they followed the receding waters. Families that had once fished and gathered along lush rivers migrated toward the coasts or to the edges of ancient springs. The interior, once rich with grass and game, hardened into desert. The wind carried sand like knives, stripping the land of its softness. But the people did not despair. They had faced scarcity before. They knew that the land, though harsh, never truly abandoned those who understood its language. In these times, knowledge became as precious as water. The elders were living libraries, carrying in memory the locations of hidden wells, waterholes, and underground springs. Their stories, sung in the old tongues, were more than myths. They were maps. Each verse, each rhythm, described the shape of a mountain, the taste of a rock, the smell of rain. These songlines guided travelers across thousands of kilometers, linking the deserts to the coasts, the living to the ancestors. To survive, the people divided and spread out. Some bands remained near the tropical north, where monsoon rains still arrived each year in violent bursts. Others journeyed into the heart of the continent, into lands so dry that rain might fall only once in a lifetime. There, they learned to live with scarcity as a companion, not an enemy. The desert dwellers became masters of reading the invisible. They could tell where underground water lay by the color of distant grass or the flight of birds. They tracked animals not only by footprints, but by the faint shift of dust or the whisper of disturbed leaves. Every sound, every scent was a sign. In a place where nothing could be wasted, observation became art. The people learned to harvest moisture from roots and tubers, to dig for frogs that burrowed deep during drought, and to drink the dew that formed on stones at dawn. Their tools evolved, spears hardened by fire, boomerangs shaped for hunting small, fast prey, digging sticks carved for precision. They found ways to cook food underground, using hot coals and sealed pits to trap flavor and preserve resources. To the outsider, it might have looked like struggle. To them, it was balance. The desert was not dead. It was simply sleeping, waiting for rain. And when the rain finally came, sometimes after years, the transformation was miraculous. Seeds buried in dust erupted into color. Flowers carpeted the sand, frogs called from flooded gullies, and birds returned in flocks that darkened the sky. The people sang louder then, thanking the spirits who had awakened the land. The rhythm of their lives matched the rhythm of the earth. They did not fight the climate. They moved with it. When food was scarce, they traveled lightly. When the rains came, they gathered, feasting and sharing stories of the old times. Every drought, every flood, every fire was folded into the dreaming, transforming hardship into wisdom. But even wisdom could not stop loss. As the centuries passed, some places became too harsh to sustain life. Lakes that had once supported entire communities dried completely. Fossilized fish bones and shells remain there today, silent memorials to vanished waters. The people moved on, carrying memories like embers. In this long struggle, a new kind of resilience emerged, one not of conquest, but of belonging. The first Australians did not see themselves as separate from the drought or the flood. They were part of its cycle, participants in the breathing of the world. When the rains failed, it was not seen as punishment, but as a reminder to respect the land, to listen more closely. And so they adapted not only their bodies but their minds. They learned to think in long time, deep time, where centuries flowed like rivers. To survive in such an environment required a sense of patience foreign to most human societies. They understood that the earth moves slowly, that the present moment is only one breath in an endless dream. During the long dry, culture deepened. Rituals evolved to mirror the struggle for balance. Water holes became sacred sites, places of gathering and ceremony. Fire, once a tool of plenty, became a symbol of both destruction and renewal. Songs grew longer, richer, carrying lessons of humility and endurance. When night fell on the desert and the stars blazed without number, the people would lie on the sand and read the sky as others read scripture. The Milky Way was a river, the dark constellations its creatures. They told stories of the emu in the sky, the seven sisters, and the hunter Orion, weaving them into moral codes and seasonal calendars. In those stars they saw both ancestors and destiny. For them, the heavens were not far away. They were the mirror of the earth. What happened below was echoed above. If the land suffered, so did the stars. If people lived in harmony, the sky shone brighter. In this worldview, no drought was meaningless. Every challenge carried instruction. To modern science, the survival of humans in such extremes seems miraculous. Yet archaeological evidence shows that throughout even the harshest phases of the Ice Age and the subsequent aridification, human presence never disappeared. While glaciers crushed Europe and deserts consumed Africa's heart, people continued to live, hunt, and dream in Australia's interior. No other human culture on Earth has such continuity. Their endurance was not a matter of luck. It was intelligence, an intelligence not of technology, but of relationship. They understood systems long before science named them. The cycles of weather, fire, and migration were recorded in their songs and myths, encoded in memory for tens of thousands of years. In that sense, the first Australians were the world's first ecologists. They observed, recorded, adapted, and passed it on. Their data was poetry. Their science was ceremony. But the results were undeniable. Survival through 40 millennia of climatic chaos. As the long dry deepened, so too did the dreaming. It became not only a story of creation, but of endurance. The ancestors who once shaped the rivers and mountains now guided their descendants through drought and dust. Every hardship became part of the cosmic narrative, proof that life endures even in the emptiest places. When the rains finally returned after a long absence, and the desert bloomed again in red and gold. It was not seen as relief, it was rebirth. The people gathered around the first pools, painted their bodies with ochre, and sang the land back to life. Their songs rose into the sky, blending with the cry of birds and the rumble of thunder. They knew then, as they had always known, that the land would change, the water would vanish, and the fire would burn again. But as long as humans remembered the songs, the world would never end. Even in the harshest times, the first Australians did not see themselves as conquerors of the land, but as one part of its endless conversation. To live here, in this continent of drought and fire, was to understand that survival meant balance. The earth was not theirs to rule, it was their kin. They listened to its breath, its silence, its rhythm, and in return, the land kept them alive. By the time the long droughts settled over the interior, every human sense had become a tool of survival. A hunter could smell rain on the wind hours before the first drops fell. A woman gathering roots could feel moisture in the soil through her bare feet. Children learned early that knowledge was food, that memory was protection. Every movement of the land, every shift in light, every call of a bird, carried meaning. Through this intimacy, people learned to live not against nature, but with it. The hunter was not simply a killer, he was a student of life. He knew which tracks belonged to kangaroo, which to emu, and how to tell their age by the curve of the heel print. He could read wind direction by how dust settled on a stone. A thrown spear was not random. It followed rules of physics taught through generations of imitation and practice. The boomerang, that uniquely Australian invention, embodied this knowledge, an aerodynamic miracle shaped by trial, error, and patient observation. To craft one required not only skill but an understanding of the wind's voice. The gatherers, too, were scientists in their own right. They mapped the flowering of plants, the migration of insects, the cycles of fruit and seed. They used fire not only to hunt but to cultivate, clearing ground so edible tubers and grasses could grow again. Their gathering routes were as complex as trade networks, linking ecosystems across vast distances. And yet, this sophistication was never separated from spirituality. Each act of hunting or harvesting was accompanied by ritual, songs to honor the spirit of the animal, gestures to thank the plant for its gift. To take without asking was forbidden. To waste was sin. The dreaming had taught them that every creature, every stone, every pool of water had a soul. To live ethically was to live reciprocally. Across thousands of generations, this worldview created a society in perfect ecological equilibrium. Populations remained small, not from ignorance, but from wisdom. To have more was not to be richer, it was to risk imbalance. Children were spaced apart by cultural design, ensuring that resources could sustain all. Sharing was law. No one starved alone, and no one hoarded plenty. Their social structures reflected this harmony. Clans and kin groups were bound by law and lineage, each with its own totems, spiritual ancestors represented by animals, plants, or natural forces. A person might be of the kangaroo or of the waterhole, inheriting responsibilities toward that being or place. These totemic bonds formed a moral web across the continent, dictating how people hunted, whom they married, and how they related to the environment. It was not government in the modern sense, but it was governance, an invisible network of respect and duty that kept both people and planet in balance. Trade routes connected distant clans, stretching thousands of kilometers across the land. Ochre from the Kimberley, shells from the coast, and stone from the central deserts all passed between groups through ceremonies of exchange. These journeys were not mere commerce, they were renewal. Each trade meeting reaffirmed kinship ties and shared mythologies. ensuring that no group was isolated even in the most remote desert. Through these connections, knowledge flowed like water. Techniques, songs, and stories migrated from one end of the continent to the other. If a drought struck in one region, news of distant rain could travel through songlines, guiding people to refuge. The continent was vast, but the human network was vaster still, woven together by memory and faith. At night, the desert glittered under a canopy of stars so bright that it seemed the sky itself was alive. Around their fires, families gathered to listen to the elders, the keepers of law and story. They spoke of the ancestors who shaped the world, of how to find the waterhole hidden beneath the red rock, of how the stars in the Milky Way mirrored the emu on Earth. In the flicker of flame, these lessons were carved into the minds of children who would one day teach them again. The continuity is staggering. Modern linguists studying Aboriginal oral traditions have discovered that some stories encode events that happened over 10,000 years ago. Volcanic eruptions, coastal flooding, the appearance of new islands. For memory to persist that long, it must have been tended like a flame. Knowledge was communal, not personal. An elder's wisdom belonged to all, just as fire belonged to all. The duty of memory was collective. Even in isolation, no one was alone in time. Through isolation, their genetic line too remained distinct. Modern DNA studies show that the Aboriginal Australians represent one of the oldest continuous populations on Earth, with ancestors remaining in the same region for over 50,000 years. While empires rose and fell elsewhere, while ice melted and seas rose to swallow land bridges, these people stayed, enduring, adapting, remembering. Their art continued to evolve too, even as the climate changed. In the dry shelters of Arnhem Land, they painted on stone using the pigments of earth and blood. Some images depicted animals, others beings from the dreaming, spirits half human, half beast, whose gestures conveyed moral lessons. One famous style, known as X-ray art, revealed the inner organs of fish and mammals, suggesting that the artists were not just depicting, but understanding. Studying anatomy through careful observation, it was science expressed as spirituality. The dreaming itself expanded to absorb new realities. When the sea rose at the end of the Ice Age, swallowing the lowlands that had once connected Australia to New Guinea and Tasmania, the people did not record it as disaster, but as transformation. In their songs, they said the ancestors walked into the sea and became fish, that the ocean claimed what had always belonged to it. Even the loss of entire coastlines became part of the story of belonging. Harmony did not mean comfort. Life was still hard, hunger still came, death was never far. But meaning softened the edge of fear. To die was to return to the dreaming, to join the ancestors in the sky or the soil. To live well was to keep the land well. When the rains finally came after years of drought, the people celebrated not victory but reunion. They painted their bodies with ochre and danced beside the filling waterholes, their songs blending with the cries of newly awakened frogs. The desert bloomed again, red and gold under the first sun after rain. In that moment, all boundaries dissolved, between people and land, between time and eternity. This was not survival in the modern sense. It was symbiosis, and it worked. For more than 40 millennia, humans and nature coexisted in balance across a continent that modern societies still struggle to understand. Their success was not measured in monuments or machines, but in continuity. While cities elsewhere crumbled into dust, the songlines of Australia kept singing. If civilization means the art of living together, humans, animals, and Earth, then perhaps the first true civilization was born not in stone, but in sand. Even now, when we listen to the wind that moves across the red heart of the continent, we might still hear the faint echo of that ancient wisdom, the whisper of fire, the rhythm of rain, and the voice of a people who learned that harmony, not conquest, is the greatest form of survival. The wind that once carried ancient songs now carried something else, the whispers of discovery. Beneath Australia's red soil lay secrets buried for tens of thousands of years, waiting for hands and minds that could read the past in dust and stone. The dreaming had always said that the land remembers everything. Now, scientists were learning how to listen. The story began in the 20th century, when archaeologists and geologists first turned their attention to the dry heart of the continent. For centuries, European settlers had viewed Australia as a place without deep history, a young land, inhabited by primitive peoples. But each shovel of sand, each fragment of bone, told a different story. This continent was home to one of the world's most ancient and continuous civilizations. The discovery that changed everything came from the shores of Lake Mungo, a shimmering salt pan in the arid expanse of New South Wales. In 1969, amid dunes of powdered white sand, a geologist named Jim Bowler found something that would rewrite human history. The cremated remains of a woman, burned and buried with care. Her bones, later known as Mungo Lady, were over 40,000 years old. It was a revelation. Until then, few believed that humans had lived in Australia for so long. The burial was not only proof of their presence, but of their humanity, ritual, respect, belief in life after death. Soon after, another skeleton emerged from the same lakebed. Mungo Man, laid to rest with his hands crossed in his lap, his body sprinkled with red ochre. He was 42,000 years old, perhaps older. The ochre came from a quarry far to the north, meaning it had been carried hundreds of kilometers for this ceremony. This was no random act. It was religion, art, and science combined, a symbol of community and care. To those who found him, Mungo Man was not a fossil. He was an ancestor. To the Aboriginal elders who visited the site, he was proof of what they had always known. We have been here since the beginning. As radiocarbon dating improved, so did the astonishment. Other sites began to speak. Stone tools from Majed Bebe in Arnhem Land dated to 65,000 years ago, pushing back the timeline of human arrival beyond any prior estimate. In the shelters of Kakadu, layers of ash, pigment, and bone told of continuous habitation stretching across millennia. Each stratum was a page in the Earth's diary, each artifact a sentence in the long story of survival. To uncover these traces required more than excavation. It required patience, reverence, and collaboration. Aboriginal custodians often guided scientists, explaining that these were not discoveries, but rememberings. Where the scientists saw sediment and artifact, the elders saw family, spirit, and dreaming. The land did not belong to the past. It was alive, and every dig was an act of communication. Jim Bowler himself would later say, "It wasn't that we found Mungo Man. He found us." The process of dating these ancient remains revealed the extraordinary precision of modern science. Carbon-14 dating worked for younger samples, but for older layers, beyond 50,000 years, scientists turned to uranium series analysis and optically stimulated luminescence, OSL. By measuring the trapped electrons in sand grains, they could determine the last time those grains were exposed to sunlight. With that technique, archaeologists could date the moment a fire burned or a footprint was covered by wind-blown dust. Each discovery illuminated a piece of an immense mosaic. At Majed Bebe, stone flakes bore microscopic patterns that revealed how they had been struck and sharpened. Some were stained with ochre, suggesting artistic activity, not just hunting. Fragments of grinding stones hinted at the processing of seeds long before agriculture existed elsewhere. Tiny animal bones told of meals eaten, of nights by firelight in a world of megafauna. These early Australians were not struggling nomads. They were innovators in a land of extremes. But perhaps the most profound revelation came not from what they made, but from how long they stayed. The continuous occupation of these sites means that through ice ages and floods, droughts and storms, humans never abandoned Australia. In a planet of shifting empires and vanishing cultures, this unbroken thread stands alone. As scientists uncovered these truths, the narrative of human evolution began to change. For centuries, textbooks had framed progress as a march from Africa to Europe to civilization. But the evidence from Australia revealed another kind of brilliance: endurance. Civilization, it seemed, did not require cities or bronze. It required relationship with land, with memory, with each other. The collaboration between archaeologists and Aboriginal elders deepened this realization. The elders spoke of dreaming stories that described volcanic eruptions, sea level rise, and the creation of islands, events confirmed by geological records tens of thousands of years old. One such story from the Gunditj Mara people of Victoria tells of a fiery mountain that spat lava and destroyed the land. Scientists later identified the eruption of Mount Gambier, which occurred about 5,000 years ago, the exact event described in the tale. Such correlations blurred the line between myth and history. They showed that oral traditions, carefully maintained, can preserve factual memory across unimaginable spans of time. The dreaming was not a fantasy. It was a scientific archive written in song and spirit. The more researchers dug, the more they realized how much remained hidden. Under layers of sediment, submerged beneath coastlines now drowned by rising seas, lie the remnants of ancient camps, tools, and pathways. During the Ice Age, the Australian coast extended far beyond its current line, forming great plains where people hunted and gathered. As the glaciers melted, those lands vanished underwater, along with untold chapters of human history. Today, underwater archaeologists are beginning to explore those lost worlds, using sonar mapping and remote submersibles to search for traces of the first Australians' coastal life. In the depths of the Arafura Sea, they have found what appear to be ancient river channels, once surrounded by vegetation and life. Somewhere down there, under meters of sand and coral, may rest the remains of the very first landing sites, the footprints of the ocean crossers who began it all. To dig into Australia's past is to dig into humanity's own beginning. The discoveries here have redefined what it means to be human. We are not only tool makers or builders, we are storytellers, record keepers, dreamers. We have always sought meaning in the land beneath our feet. In the end, the scientists found more than artifacts. They found a dialogue between two ways of knowing, one written in equations and radiocarbon, the other sung through generations by the keepers of the dreaming. Together, they revealed a truth larger than either alone. that history is not a straight line, but a circle, just as the first Australians always said. In the red light of dawn over Lake Mungo, the wind still whispers through the dunes. The sand moves, the shadows shift, and somewhere beneath them lie the bones of those who first walked this continent. Their spirits remain, not silent, but waiting, reminding us that the story of humanity is not measured by empires or inventions, but by how deeply we remember where we came from. If archaeology uncovers the bones of the past, genetics reveals its breadth. In the last few decades, strands of ancient DNA, so fragile they crumble at a whisper, have begun to speak again, carrying stories that predate every written word. When scientists extracted and sequenced these genetic relics from ancient remains and modern descendants, they discovered something astonishing. The blood of the first Australians carries echoes of the earliest chapters of humanity itself. The journey of this revelation began not in Australia, but in the frozen caves of Siberia. There, deep inside the Denisova cave, researchers found a fragment of a finger bone from a young girl who had lived over 50,000 years ago. When her genome was analyzed, scientists realized she belonged to a previously unknown species of ancient human, the Denisovans, distant cousins of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. At first, the discovery seemed remote, a curiosity of northern latitudes. But when the same geneticists compared the Denisovan genome with DNA from living populations around the world, the surprise was immediate and profound. The highest concentration of Denisovan ancestry was not in Asia or Europe, but in Papua New Guinea and among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. The implication was staggering. The ancestors of Australia's first peoples had interbred with Denisovans somewhere in Asia, tens of thousands of years before reaching Sahul. This meant that a ghost lineage, an ancient, vanished humanity, still lived quietly within their cells. The crossing of genes had become the crossing of time. To the scientific mind, this was data. To the poetic, it was destiny. The discovery rewove the web of human migration. It showed that the journey out of Africa was not a single straight path, but a braided river of encounters and exchanges. As modern humans moved eastward, they met and mingled with other species, absorbing fragments of their DNA, each encounter leaving a signature of adaptation. From Neanderthals, we inherited immunity and skin variation. From Denisovans, people of the Pacific inherited something more mysterious: the capacity to survive in new, extreme environments. One of the most remarkable gifts from the Denisovans is the EPAS1 gene, a variant that helps the blood carry oxygen more efficiently at high altitudes. This same gene is found among modern Tibetans and in traces among Aboriginal populations and Papuans, evidence of ancient inheritance. Without it, life in mountain regions might have been impossible. Through interbreeding, one branch of humanity had given another the tools to adapt to worlds beyond their origin. When geneticists turned their focus directly to Australia, the story deepened. In 2017, an international team of scientists sequenced the genomes of Aboriginal Australians from remote communities, alongside those of Papuans and other Oceanian groups. Their findings confirmed that these populations are among the oldest continuous lineages on Earth, tracing back more than 50,000 years to the first migration into Sahul. Even more striking was what the data did not show: significant mixing with outside populations until the arrival of Europeans in the last few centuries. While almost every other region of the world saw waves of invasion, migration, and displacement, the people of Australia remained genetically isolated for tens of millennia. Their DNA is a time capsule, preserving a direct connection to the earliest modern humans who ventured beyond Africa. In other words, when an Aboriginal person walks the land today, their genes carry an unbroken record of humanity's oldest journey. They are not simply the descendants of those who came first. They are those people, still walking, still singing, still alive. But genes tell more than origin. They tell adaptation. The human body, sculpted by thousands of generations, records its relationship with the land. In the north, where the climate is tropical, Aboriginal populations evolved physiological traits for heat regulation and resistance to certain tropical diseases. In the deserts, selection favored endurance, metabolism control, and the ability to thrive on sparse diets. Over millennia, human biology and the Australian continent shaped one another like river and stone. Modern science calls this co-evolution. The dreaming calls it kinship. It is not only ancient DNA that carries this story, but living memory. Aboriginal oral histories speak of sea level rises that swallowed coasts and islands at the end of the last ice age, events that occurred 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, yet are described in astonishing geographic detail. These stories are not coincidence. They are cultural memory, transmitted so precisely that it aligns with geological data. The genetic and the oral together form one continuous record of humanity's dialogue with time. As scientists collaborated more closely with indigenous communities, the relationship between science and story grew more respectful, more intertwined. Where Western research once sought to study Aboriginal people, it now began to learn from them. The elders' understanding of ancestry, of belonging to the land rather than owning it, mirrored the very findings of genetics, that all life is interconnected, and that each generation is part of a single living continuum. One elder, when shown the results of DNA sequencing that linked his community to the first arrivals 65,000 years ago, simply smiled and said, "We didn't need your machines to tell us that. We have always known." Science had confirmed what the dreaming had sung for countless ages. The people and the land are one. But the revelations did not end there. The genetic map of Australia revealed intricate patterns of diversity, distinct lineages in the north, center, and south of the continent, each tied to language and territory. These differences show that even within isolation there was movement, trade, and interconnection. Populations split and rejoined, adapting to rivers, deserts, and coasts, yet always maintaining cultural bonds. It was a continent-wide web of life, mirrored in the genome itself. For evolutionary biology, Australia became a living laboratory, a place where humanity's oldest experiment in adaptation had played out in near-perfect isolation. The first Australians survived not because they conquered nature, but because they harmonized with it. Their genetic story reflects resilience, flexibility, and endurance, the very traits that define our species. In the end, DNA and dreaming tell the same truth in different tongues. Where science speaks of genes passed through time, the dreaming speaks of spirits reborn through generations. Where science traces migration through mutations, the dreaming traces it through songlines that stretch across sky and soil. Both describe continuity, the miracle that life remembers itself. Today, the faces of the first Australians carry not only their own story, but the story of all of us. Within their blood flows the ancient courage of those who first crossed oceans, the strength of the Denisovans who climbed mountains, and the endurance of people who thrived where none should have survived. When we look into the double helix, we do not just see molecules. We see memory, the same memory that once gazed across an open sea and dared to imagine another shore. And perhaps that is the greatest echo of all, that in our genes, as in our dreams, the past never truly dies. It simply changes shape, a song written in flesh, still being sung by the living earth. For more than 40 millennia, the first Australians lived upon their vast continent in a rhythm so constant that the earth itself seemed to hum in tune with their footsteps. Empires elsewhere rose and fell. Ice ages came and went. Languages were born and forgotten. Yet across deserts, rainforests, and coasts, the people of Sahul endured, not frozen in time but flowing with it. Their resilience was not mere survival, it was harmony refined into art. Each generation inherited not only land and kin but law. The dreaming was both constitution and philosophy, an eternal reminder that life was a web of relationships, not hierarchies. The elders carried within them thousands of years of ecological and moral wisdom, how to find water in drought, how to burn the land without destroying it, when to move with the seasons and when to stay. This knowledge was the inheritance of all, preserved through memory, ritual, and song. Their world was not static. Over the millennia, climates shifted, coastlines redrew themselves, rivers changed course, yet culture flexed like water, never breaking. When sea levels rose and separated Tasmania and New Guinea from mainland Australia, the people did not vanish into confusion, they adapted. New languages formed, new roots emerged, but the core philosophy, connection to country, remained unbroken. It is estimated that before European contact, Australia was home to more than 500 distinct nations, each with its own language, territory, and law. These were not isolated tribes, but a continent-wide network of interlinked cultures. Ceremonial gatherings drew people from hundreds of kilometers apart to exchange songs, goods, and stories. Trade routes carried ochre, pearl shell, stone, and message sticks from one end of the continent to the other. Through this web of exchange, knowledge flowed freely, ensuring that no discovery, a new tool, a sacred story, a food source, was ever lost. The strength of this system lay in its diversity. Each region developed unique adaptations to its environment. In the north, the Yolngu people mastered maritime life, building dugout canoes and harvesting sea turtle and trepang long before Asian traders arrived. In the lush east, clans along the rivers of New South Wales developed fish traps and stone weirs, engineering feats still visible today at Brewarrina, where water was guided through labyrinths of rock to sustain life year-round. In the desert heart, the Pintupi and Arunta tracked invisible paths of wind and spirit, carrying fire and myth through landscapes others would deem lifeless. Everywhere the same principle held: balance. Take only what you need, give back what you can, and remember that every act touches the entire world. Modern scientists now understand what the first peoples lived daily, that such systems were sustainable not for decades or centuries, but for tens of thousands of years. No other human culture has matched that record. While other civilizations exhausted their soil and forests in pursuit of growth, the Aboriginal nations practiced a kind of ecological diplomacy. They treated nature not as resource, but as relative. The stories they told encoded this ethics in beauty. The dreaming narratives are not simple myths, but living blueprints for survival, allegories of balance and humility. In one story, a greedy hunter hoards water during a drought and is turned into a frog. In another, the rainbow serpent punishes those who take more than their share. These are moral parables as old as any religious text, yet far older than any written scripture. They taught respect, restraint, and awe, the virtues of endurance. Even the landscape bears their fingerprints. Satellite imagery has revealed evidence of ancient land management, networks of fire scars, patterns of vegetation that follow old songlines, and remnants of stone fish traps that predate the pyramids. To walk across Australia today is to walk across the world's oldest living architecture, a continent shaped by thought, not concrete. But perhaps the truest measure of resilience lies not in technology, but in memory. The first Australians carried their history without writing, without monuments. Their archive was the human mind, their library the landscape itself. Songs were their time machines. Through them, the past never disappeared. It was performed, renewed, and returned to life. When the children danced in the dust to the beat of clapsticks, they were not imitating ancestors. They were the ancestors, continuing a performance that began before history began. Each movement, each rhythm, reaffirmed that the dreaming was not a story that had happened, but a reality that was happening still. And then, after tens of thousands of years of continuity, came the rupture. Just over 2 centuries ago, an instant in the deep chronology of this land, strange sails appeared on the horizon. The people who came ashore did not ask permission of the spirits or the custodians. They came with metal, fire, and laws written on paper. To them, the continent was empty, a terra nullius, a land belonging to no one. They could not have been more wrong. When the first European colonists stepped onto Australian soil in 1788, they encountered a civilization older than any they had known, but they did not see it. They mistook simplicity for ignorance, mobility for aimlessness, song for superstition, and in their blindness, they began to erase what they could not understand. For the first Australians, this was not the first drought, not the first storm, but it was the first invasion. Disease, displacement, and violence tore through the continent like a second apocalypse. Entire nations vanished within generations. Languages that had been sung for 40,000 years fell silent. The dreaming itself seemed to flicker, as sacred sites were desecrated, and the law of the land was replaced by foreign courts. Yet even in the face of this devastation, the people endured. They hid their songs in whispers. They painted their memories on rock where no colonizer could read them. They passed their stories through code and symbol, disguising sacred knowledge as children's tales. Some traditions went underground for 100 years, but they never died. Elders today still speak of this time as the deep wound, but also as proof of strength. The land itself became their refuge, and their languages, once forbidden, survived in the breath of those who refused to forget. Modern Australia is beginning, slowly, to listen again. Archaeology and genetics have confirmed what the elders have always known, that the first peoples of Australia represent the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Their survival is not a relic of the past, but a triumph of adaptation, intellect, and spiritual integrity. When a Yolnu elder sings to the sea, when a Pintupi child traces their clan totem in the sand, when a fire burns softly in the desert night, the dreaming continues, unbroken. The story of resilience is not just theirs, it belongs to all of us, because in remembering how they endured, humanity remembers what it once was, not masters of the earth, but caretakers, not conquerors, but listeners. In the silence of the outback, where stars shimmer like scattered embers and the air smells faintly of rain on dust, one can still feel that ancient pulse beneath the ground, the heartbeat older than pyramids, older than memory. It whispers, "We are still here." Through war, displacement, and the slow violence of colonization, the first Australians endured. Yet what is most extraordinary is not only their survival, but the survival of their knowledge. A knowledge so vast, so intertwined with land, language, and spirit, that even centuries of suppression could not silence it. They were called primitive by those who could not hear their science, who mistook oral tradition for ignorance. But across 65,000 years, these people had mapped an entire continent in memory alone. Their archives were not on parchment or in machines. They were sung, carved, painted, and lived. Every hill, every river, every constellation carried data: geography, genealogy, law, medicine, ethics. The keepers of this data were the elders, custodians of memory who walked with the authority of time itself. To understand Aboriginal knowledge is to see that it was never divided into disciplines. There was no science separate from religion, no art distinct from law. All flowed from the same source: country. In Aboriginal thought, country does not mean land. It is a living entity that includes the soil, the plants, the waters, the winds, the ancestors, and the people themselves. One belongs to country as one belongs to family. To speak of my country is not ownership, but relationship, the same way one might speak of my mother. The law of country governs everything. It tells where one can hunt, which songs one may sing, which places are sacred, and when the fires should be lit. It defines identity, morality, and purpose. Every person has a duty to care for country, and country, in turn, cares for them. This philosophy, older than any known scripture, also guided medicine, astronomy, and social order. The healers, known in some regions as Nankari or Marngich, carried knowledge passed through countless generations. They treated wounds with antiseptic plants now recognized by modern pharmacology as antibiotic. They used smoke to cleanse infection, ochre to close skin, and chants to restore mental balance. Their understanding of the human body was not merely physical, it was spiritual. To heal a person was to heal their connection with country, to bring their soul back into harmony with the land. Long before microscopes, Aboriginal medicine had identified more than 1,000 medicinal plants: eucalyptus, tea tree, emu bush, wattle seed, snake vine, each used with precise knowledge of dosage and preparation. Modern scientists continue to study these remedies, often confirming their antibacterial and antiviral properties. The astronomers of the dreaming were no less advanced. Across the continent, people studied the movement of stars and planets, using them to mark seasons, migrations, and ceremonies. The Yolnu of Arnhem Land knew that the tides corresponded with the moon's phases long before Galileo. The Burong people of Victoria mapped constellations invisible to northern observers. Not only the bright stars, but the dark shapes between them, like the emu in the sky, whose form is traced not by light but by shadow in the Milky Way. This astronomy was woven into story and ceremony. When the emu rose in a certain position, it was time to gather eggs. When it vanished, the season of hunting began. The sky was both calendar and compass. An illuminated dreaming stretched across infinity. Language was the code that bound all of this together. Each word in an Aboriginal tongue was a seed of meaning, dense and precise. One term could describe a place, a person's role in relation to it, and the spiritual story tied to that land. To lose a language was to lose an entire dimension of existence. That is why, even today, the fight to preserve these languages is not academic. It is a fight for life itself. Before colonization, there were more than 500 Aboriginal languages and 750 dialects spoken across the continent. Many were nearly extinguished through forced assimilation policies in the 19th and 20th centuries, when children were taken from their families and forbidden to speak their mother tongues. Yet, remarkably, dozens have survived, and others are being revived through community programs, recordings, and the work of elders who still remember. Each recovered word is a resurrection. Each language that returns to breath is another star relit in the sky. And the songs, the ancient songlines, still stretch across the land, invisible highways of sound connecting sacred places. When sung, they awaken the landscape, recharging the spiritual circuitry of the world. A songline might cross hundreds of kilometers, linking mountains to rivers, deserts to sea. Each verse corresponds to a landmark. Each melody encodes direction, history, and law. Anthropologists once called them navigational songs, but to the people who sing them, they are more than maps. They are veins through which life itself flows. When the elders say that singing keeps the land alive, it is not a metaphor. In their understanding, silence kills. Song sustains. Even in the modern age, when concrete and noise have replaced much of the old world, songlines persist. In the deserts of Central Australia, the Pintupi and Warlpiri still travel their ancestral paths, singing as they go. In the north, Yolnu ceremonies echo across the mangrove swamps, their rhythms synchronizing with the beat of waves. On the coasts of New South Wales, dancers reenact the journeys of the whale and the pelican, keeping memory embodied in motion. Knowledge in this world is not taught in classrooms. It is earned through listening, waiting, and being chosen. A child watches for years before they are allowed to learn a sacred song or paint a totem. Each stage of learning mirrors age, trust, and connection. The purpose of education is not mastery, but understanding, the kind that binds a person to their ancestors and to the future simultaneously. Today, in modern Australia, the knowledge keepers are re-emerging. Elders and youth work together to record languages, replant medicinal herbs, and restore traditional fire practices that reduce bushfire risk. Techniques now recognized by government agencies as vital to environmental health. Universities collaborate with Aboriginal communities not as subjects of study but as co-authors of science. And still, the deeper truth remains. This knowledge was never lost. It was waiting, like seeds in dry earth, for rain. Now, the rain has come. Across the continent, the first peoples are singing again, reclaiming the right to speak for country. Their art fills galleries, their voices shape law, and their wisdom guides ecological restoration. Modern Australia is beginning to realize that the future of the land may depend on its oldest teachers. When an elder steps onto sacred ground and begins to sing, they are doing more than honoring the past. They are performing an act of remembrance on behalf of the entire planet, reminding us that survival is not about domination, but relationship. For the first Australians, knowledge is not power. It is responsibility. And as the red dawn breaks across the desert, the voices of the knowledge keepers rise again, soft at first, then strong. The wind carries their songs across hills and waterholes, across cities and silence, across time itself. They have been singing for 65,000 years. They are still singing now. The morning sun rises over the red heart of Australia, turning the rocks of Uluru into molten gold. The air is still, but it vibrates with something ancient, an energy that seems to hum beneath the soil. For the first Australians, this is not imagination. It is the pulse of country, the living presence of ancestors who have never left. And for scientists, historians, and dreamers across the world, this land has become a mirror, reflecting back 40,000 years of humanity's most enduring truth, that to belong to the earth is greater than to own it. Across this vast continent, the traces of the first people are not ruins, but relationships. There are no pyramids, no marble temples, no bronze statues of kings. Yet the culture that grew here outlasted them all. Its monuments are made of song and memory, its architecture carved into the mind and the sky. While stone civilizations rose and fell, the dreaming never ceased. The legacy of the first Australians is not a story of domination or discovery. It is a story of continuity. In an age where change defines progress, their wisdom teaches that longevity is the truest sign of success. What they achieved was not conquest over nature, but coexistence with it. A feat that modern civilization, for all its technology, still struggles to understand. When archaeologists kneel in the sands of Lake Mungo or the cliffs of Kakadu, brushing away the dust of tens of thousands of years, they are not uncovering relics of a vanished world. They are touching a civilization that never ended. The descendants of those who lit the first fires still walk the same land, speak the same stories, and sing the same constellations. Their continuity is the bridge between prehistory and tomorrow. In every other part of the world, humanity's story is one of collapse and renewal. Cities crumble, forests fall, rivers dry, empires fade. But in Australia, the people endured, through ice ages, through floods, through the violence of colonization. That endurance is their greatest legacy, proof that human life does not need domination to flourish. Their philosophy of country offers a model for the planet's uncertain future. As climate change reshapes the Earth once more, their way of seeing that all beings are kin, that the health of the land is the health of the people, has become not only relevant, but necessary. Scientists now study ancient fire management to prevent modern infernos. Ecologists turn to Aboriginal rangers to learn how to read drought and flood patterns. Healers teach biologists the medicinal uses of plants that Western science is only beginning to classify. What once was dismissed as myth is now recognized as knowledge. And yet, beyond all practical wisdom, there lies a deeper inheritance, a spiritual truth. The dreaming teaches that time is not a straight path from past to future, but a circle, an endless now where ancestors and descendants share the same heartbeat. This idea, once considered primitive by Western minds, now resonates with modern physics and philosophy. The universe itself, it seems, remembers, just as the dreaming has always said. To live in the dreaming is to understand that one's life is not a separate story, but a verse in an eternal song. When a person dies, their body returns to the land, their spirit to the sky, and their voice joins the chorus of creation. The land remembers them, not as ghosts, but as presence. In this worldview, immortality is not in heaven, it is underfoot. Perhaps this is why the first Australians have always moved with such quiet dignity, even in the aftermath of loss, of land, language, and countless lives. They continue to stand with the calm of those who know that time will return what has been taken. Their strength is not in resistance, but in endurance, the patience of stone and song. As Australia reckons with its past, the dreaming has begun to speak again through art, ceremony, and scholarship. Rock paintings once dismissed as primitive are now recognized as masterpieces of abstraction and depth. Songs once confined to the outback are performed on global stages. Universities consult elders before research begins, and when an Aboriginal child learns to speak the language of their ancestors, the continuity of 65,000 years stretches unbroken into the present moment. Their legacy reaches far beyond their own shores. For all of humanity, their story is a mirror held to our collective soul. It asks, what does it mean to be civilized? If civilization is measured by how long it endures without destroying itself, then the first Australians are the most successful civilization the world has ever known. Their way of life, decentralized, sustainable, spiritual, was not static. It was dynamic, precisely balanced to an environment that many outsiders saw as barren. They turned survival into art, and art into religion. They made science a song. For modern humanity, the lesson is clear. The future will not be saved by technology alone, but by perspective. The same perspective that allowed the first Australians to live through 40 millennia of change. We must learn again that progress without harmony is collapse, and that wisdom begins where arrogance ends. Standing on the escarpments of Kakadu, one can still see the ochre handprints of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. Each print says the same thing. I was here. I belonged. I cared for this land. The red pigment glows in the sun, unchanged by time, as though those hands were pressed there yesterday. The fingers point not backward into the past, but forward, toward a future that remembers its origins. The dreaming continues to guide that future. It teaches that the land is alive, that memory is sacred, and that humanity's duty is not to rule but to participate. It reminds us that we are temporary custodians of an ancient world still breathing beneath our feet. When the wind moves across the desert at night, it carries the same rhythm that once stirred the sails of the first ocean crossers 40,000 years ago. The stars above are unchanged. They still mark the songlines of creation. The fires still burn in the bush, tended by new hands guided by old wisdom. The story that began when humans first looked across an impossible sea and chose to believe in another world has not ended. It is still being sung. The legacy of those voyagers, those who crossed oceans, tamed fire, painted spirit on stone and dreamed the world into being, lives not only in Australia, but in all of us. It is the story of what it means to be human, to remember, to imagine, to endure. And as long as even one voice sings the old songs, as long as one child learns to speak to country, as long as the land itself listens, the journey that began 40,000 years ago will never end. Because humanity's oldest story is not one of conquest. It is one of belonging. Night falls on the Australian desert. The horizon glows with the last breath of the sun. And for a moment, the world holds its silence. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a single note rises, low, deep, resonant. It is the call of the didgeridoo, the world's oldest instrument. A sound that has echoed across this land for tens of thousands of years. The drone vibrates through the sand and stone, through trees and sky, and it feels as though the earth itself is remembering. In that vibration lies the entire story of humanity. From the first spark of fire in an African cave, to the crossing of the Timor Sea, to the painted cliffs of Kakadu, and the star-mapped deserts of the interior. Every rhythm, every breath, every footstep has carried forward the same unbroken message. We are part of this world, not apart from it. The 40,000-year journey was never about distance. It was about becoming, about what happens when imagination meets endurance. When the first humans stood on the Indonesian shore, staring at an ocean they could not see across, they faced not only the unknown world before them, but the limits of their own belief. And in choosing to cross, they redefined what it meant to be human. Every act that followed, the first landing, the birth of the dreaming, the creation of songlines, the balance of fire and flood, was an extension of that first leap of faith. They crossed not just the sea, but the boundary between survival and meaning endures longer than monuments. In the stillness of the outback, one can feel it, a timeless presence that defies linear history. The people who first walked this continent have not vanished into the past. They are here, in the wind, in the light, in the laughter of children learning to speak their ancestors' words again. The dreaming is not a memory, it is a frequency, always humming beneath the surface of time. Modern Australia lives atop this ancient pulse. Cities sprawl where songlines once wound. Highways trace over paths of ceremony. Satellites orbit above constellations that were mapped by naked eyes 50 millennia ago. Yet beneath it all, the old world persists, patient, waiting, whispering. The land remembers everything, and it never stops speaking to those who listen. The scientists who read genomes, the archaeologists who unearth bones, the artists who paint the spirit figures anew, all of them, knowingly or not, are participants in this remembering. What began as an investigation of the past has become an encounter with continuity. Humanity's story did not begin with writing or empire. It began with a song, and in that realization lies perhaps the greatest lesson of the entire journey. For centuries, the modern world has believed that progress means separation from nature, from spirit, from the limitations of the body. But the first Australians show that survival depends on connection, not escape. To live in balance is not to live without struggle, but to see struggle as part of the cycle. Drought and flood, birth and death, silence and song. This is the wisdom of deep time. To think in deep time is to feel one's life as a single heartbeat in a story that began long before and will continue long after. It is to know that every decision, every fire lit, every river touched, every word spoken, ripples forward into the unseen future. The ancestors are not behind us. They walk beside us. The future is not ahead. It grows beneath our feet. In that understanding, the world is not a stage but a circle, endlessly renewing, endlessly alive. As we look to the future, a planet strained by its own ambition, a species teetering between wonder and ruin, the lessons of this ancient civilization may be our most precious inheritance. Their art, science, and philosophy reveal a way of being that transcends technology. Humility before creation. They remind us that intelligence is not measured by invention but by duration, by how long we can live without destroying the hand that feeds us. For 40,000 years, the first Australians lived without kings or wars of empire, without cities or machines, yet with art, law, and knowledge of stars that rivaled any astronomers. They left no stone towers to crumble, no broken empires for archaeologists to mourn. Only stories that still breathe, paintings that still glow, and land that still feeds. Perhaps this is civilization's highest form, to leave the world intact. And so the 40,000-year journey is not only their story, it is ours. It is the story of every human who has ever looked beyond the horizon and wondered what lies beyond the known. It is the story of those who dared to imagine, who sang to the sea, who walked into the desert and listened instead of shouting. We are all descendants of that moment of courage. When the first Australians crossed the impossible ocean, they carried within them not just tools and fire, but memory. And memory, carried long enough, becomes prophecy. Their dreaming did not end in prehistory. It extends into us, into tomorrow, reminding us that to survive the coming centuries we must learn to listen again, to the earth, to each other, and to the silence between words. As the night deepens, the stars rise in their ancient order. The emu in the sky stretches across the Milky Way, its body traced by the dark spaces between the stars, a reminder that what is absent can be just as powerful as what is seen. Beneath it, a small group gathers by the fire. The elder sings, the children listen. And somewhere, unseen, the ancestors smile. The wind shifts, ash drifts upward, glowing briefly before fading into the darkness. The same dust that once clung to the feet of those first voyagers now floats above the flames, joining the sky. Time folds back upon itself, the beginning and the end becoming one. The circle is complete, but the song continues. The fire still burns. When morning comes, the first light spills across the desert. A new generation steps barefoot onto the red sand, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath them. They raise their eyes to the horizon, the same horizon their ancestors once faced, the same challenge, the same hope. The journey that began 40,000 years ago has never truly ended. It lives wherever people remember, wherever land still speaks, wherever a story refuses to die. We are the echo of that journey, every one of us. And the world, vast and old, is still singing its dreaming through us all. Every